The night they threw her from the palace steps, Illyra Voss learned the oldest truth in existence. Love is a lie, the powerful tell before they destroy you. King Draven Kalor didn't just reject his queen, he erased her like a mistake written in ash. But here's what they didn't understand about breaking someone who was born to burn. You don't kill a fire by throwing it into the dark. You feed it. So stay with me until the end of this, because what happens when nothing becomes, everything will change how you see power forever. Drop your city in the comments and smash that like, let's build this tribe together. The marble felt cold against her cheek. That was the first thing Illyra noticed when consciousness dragged her back from wherever bodies go when they stop mattering. Not the blood pooling beneath her ribs. Not the fracture in her spine that made breathing feel like swallowing glass. Just the cold. Cold like his eyes when he spoke the words. The bond is severed. She tried to move. Her fingers scraped against stone, nails tearing, leaving red streaks that looked black in the moonlight. Somewhere above, the palace loomed like a titan carved from night itself, its obsidian walls reflecting nothing, swallowing everything. The bone chandeliers still blazed in the throne room windows. The celebration continued. Of course it did. Kings don't mourn their mistakes, they drink to correcting them. Her body refused to cooperate. Legs that once carried her through the ritual dances, through the blood ceremonies, through the test of flame that proved her worthy. They were dead weight now. Useless meat attached to a consciousness that wouldn't quit. She laughed. Blood bubbled up with the sound. The irony tasted metallic. They had tested her, burned her, starved her, pushed her to the edge of what flesh could endure, and she had survived it all. Proven herself. Been chosen. The mark still blazed on her left shoulder blade, the runic scar that designated her as his, as worthy, as queen. And he had looked at it tonight, at that same mark, and decided it meant nothing. You failed the final test, he had said, his voice carrying across the throne room like a blade finding bone. Your bloodline is flawed. I cannot risk the empire on damaged goods. Damaged goods. The words echoed in her skull like a curse she couldn't exorcise. She dragged herself forward. An inch. Maybe two. Her dress, the ceremonial silk they had dressed her in for what was supposed to be the consummation night, was shredded now, torn on the descent down 73 stone steps. She had counted them on the way up, a lifetime ago. 3 hours? 4? Time moved differently when you were falling. Someone was walking toward her. She could hear boots on stone, measured and slow. Not rushing. Why would they rush? She wasn't going anywhere. The boots stopped. A shadow fell across her face. Korvax. The king's second. His executioner when subtlety wasn't required. His messenger when it was. He crouched down, and she could smell the wine on him. They had all been drinking, celebrating. She wondered what they were toasting. The king's wisdom, his ruthlessness, his ability to discard a woman like spoiled fruit. Korvax tilted his head, studying her the way you'd study an insect pinned to a board. Still breathing, he said. His voice carried no malice, no pleasure, just observation. That's unfortunate. She tried to speak. Her jaw didn't work right. Something cracked when she moved it. He stood, brushing invisible dust from his leather coat. The king was clear. No execution, no mercy. You walk away or you don't. Either way, you're already dead to the Dominion. He turned to leave, then paused. For what it's worth, he said, not looking back, you lasted longer than most. The last girl didn't make it past the flame test. Screamed herself unconscious. You? You walked through it like you were born in fire. That counted for something, but not enough. He walked away. His boots faded into silence, swallowed by the storm that was rolling in from the eastern wastes. She could smell it, ozone and dust and the promise of violence, the kind of storm that turned the world dark and washed away evidence. By morning, her blood would be gone from these steps, scrubbed clean by rain and wind and the Empire's need to forget. She closed her eyes. This is where the story should have ended, where girls who get broken by kings are supposed to surrender, supposed to fade, supposed to understand that some forces are too vast to fight, and accepting that is called wisdom. But wisdom is just another word for giving up, and Illyra Voss had never been wise. The mark on her shoulder blade began to burn, not the dull ache it had carried since the branding, something deeper, hotter, like recognition, like something waking up after a long sleep and realizing it had been caged. Her fingers dug into stone. She pulled. Her body screamed, ribs ground against each other. The fracture in her spine sent lightning through her nervous system that made her vision white out. She pulled anyway. 1 inch, 2, 3. The rain started. Fat drops that hit like fists, washing the blood from her face, soaking into the ruined silk. Thunder cracked overhead, and in that sound she heard something that might have been laughter. The world's, the gods', her own. It didn't matter. She kept pulling. By the time the sun rose, she was gone. The palace guards who came to sweep the steps found nothing. No body, no blood the rain hadn't claimed, no evidence that anything had happened here at all. Just 73 empty steps and a kingdom that had already forgotten she existed, which was exactly what she needed. Sit. 3 days crawling through mud and darkness taught Lyra what survival actually meant. Not the philosophical kind debated in palace halls over wine. The kind where your body becomes meat that refuses to quit, where dignity is a luxury you can't afford, where every breath is a negotiation with death that you win by the thinnest margin. Her hands were shredded, palms torn open on rocks she couldn't see, fingers bent wrong from clawing through terrain that didn't care if she lived or died. The infection had started on day 2. She could feel it spreading from the wounds on her back, hot tendrils of poison working through her blood. Fever turned the world into a watercolor painting, edges bleeding into each other, reality and hallucination trading places. She saw Draven's face in the clouds, heard his voice in the wind. Damaged goods. Flawed. Nothing. Words designed to unmake her, to convince her that the universe itself had rejected her, that fighting against that verdict was like fighting gravity. Pointless. Inevitable failure. But here's what kings never understand about the people they break. You can only destroy someone who still believes in the rules you made. Take away their faith in your authority, in your right to judge them, in the fundamental fairness of your world, and suddenly they're not bound by anything. Not even survival. She had stopped trying to live somewhere on day 2, stopped calculating odds, stopped preserving strength. She just moved, pulled herself forward through pure mechanical repetition because stopping meant Draven was right, and every cell in her body rejected that truth more than it rejected death. Spite, it turned out, was better fuel than hope. The Blackwood Forest denounced itself through smell first. Rot and growth tangled together, the aggressive stink of life feeding on death, feeding on life, in an endless cannibal cycle. The trees here didn't follow normal patterns. They grew in spirals, in knots, in configurations that hurt to look at too long. Bark that wept sap the color of old blood. Roots that surfaced and dove like sea serpents frozen mid-breach. She crossed the boundary without ceremony. One moment she was in the Deadlands between the Empire and the Forgotten Places. The next, the forest swallowed her whole. The temperature dropped 10 degrees. The light changed quality, turning green and sick. Sounds that might have been wind or might have been screaming echoed from deeper in. She collapsed against a trunk that felt warm, fever warm, infection warm. Or maybe the tree itself was bleeding heat. Her wounds had stopped bleeding, but they hadn't closed. Shouldn't have made it this far. The rational part of her brain, the part still capable of analysis, knew that. 3 days without food. Without water except what she could lick from leaves. Without rest because stopping meant dying and dying meant Draven won. So she hadn't stopped. The mark burned constantly now, a coal pressed against her spine that never cooled. She had tried to look at it during a moment of lucidity, twisting her arm back, fingers searching for answers. The skin felt raised, hot, changed, like something was writing itself into her flesh in a language she couldn't read yet. Something moved in the shadows between trees. She didn't have the energy to be afraid. Fear required fuel, and she was running on fumes and spite. The movement resolved into a shape. Not human, not animal. Something that wore the memory of both and belonged to neither. It stood 8 feet tall, maybe more. Lean muscle covered in fur that looked like oil and smoke had a child. Eyes that caught what little light filtered through the canopy and threw it back red. Claws that could open her from throat to groin without effort. A veil born. The things that lived in forgotten places and fed on the stupid and the lost. She met its eyes. "Come on then," she said. Her voice was raw. broken, but steady. You'll have to work for it. The creature tilted its head, studied her the way Korvax had, the way the king had, the way everyone had looked at her right before deciding she wasn't enough. Then it did something she didn't expect. It sat, haunches folding under it like a dog waiting for commands, those red eyes never leaving hers. She tried to understand. Failed. Her brain was too scrambled from pain and exhaustion to make sense of anything that wasn't immediate survival. But the creature didn't move, didn't attack, just watched. Finally she laughed. The sound hurt. Everything hurt. "What?" she asked it. "You waiting for me to die first? Rather eat corpses than fight for your meal?" The Veilborn made a sound. Low. Rumbling. Almost like speech, but in frequencies her ears couldn't quite catch. The mark on her back flared, and suddenly she understood. Not words, not language, just meaning, recognition, pack, alpha. Her hand went to the mark without thinking, fingers pressing against the heat, the wrongness, the thing that was rewriting her from the inside out. "What the hell are you?" she whispered. The Veilborn stood, turned, started walking deeper into the forest, then paused, looked back. An invitation. Or a test. Hard to tell the difference. She should have stayed there. Should have let the forest take her. Should have accepted that this was far enough. That crawling 3 days into the dark on broken bones was more than anyone could ask. Should have. Didn't. She pushed herself up. Her legs shook. Her spine felt like shattered pottery held together with spit and fury. But she stood, and she followed. Okay. The Veilborn led her to water first, a stream that ran black under the canopy but tasted clean. She drank until her stomach cramped, then drank more. Her body was so dehydrated that for the first few minutes nothing happened, the water just vanishing into tissue that had started to mummify. Then her cells remembered what hydration felt like, and she vomited everything back up, bile and water mixing on the rocks. She drank again, slower this time. Let her body remember how to process liquid. The Veilborn watched without judgment. When she finally sat back gasping, it moved again, leading her deeper. The cave wasn't much. A crack in a rock face, maybe 15 feet deep, barely tall enough to stand in, but it was dry, sheltered, hidden behind a curtain of vines that looked like they'd strangle anything that touched them. The Veilborn settled near the entrance, those red eyes fixed on the forest beyond. Standing watch. She should have been terrified, should have questioned why a predator was protecting prey, should have run or fought or done something other than accept this impossible situation. But exhaustion hit like a hammer, and consciousness went away whether she wanted it to or not. When she woke, there was food, a deer carcass, fresh, still warm, torn open at the belly where the good meat was. The Veilborn sat in the same position, watching the forest, waiting. She stared at the deer, at the meat steaming in the cool air, at the blood pooling on stone. Her stomach cramped so hard she doubled over, hunger asserting itself now that survival was momentarily handled. No fire, no tools, no ceremony, just meat and the desperate animal need to keep existing. The rational part of her, the part that remembered banquets and etiquette and what queens were supposed to be, recoiled. This was beneath her, savage, wrong. The new part, the part being written into her spine by whatever the mark was becoming, didn't care. She ate. Hands tearing into flesh, blood running down her chin, grease coating her fingers. It was the best thing she had ever tasted. Not because of flavor, because it was life, because it was fuel, because every bite was another minute of existence, another second Draven didn't get to be right about her. When she finished, she looked up. The Veilborn was still watching the forest, but one ear had swiveled toward her, aware, listening. "Thank you," she said. The creature made no response, but something in its posture relaxed. Acknowledgement, maybe, or acceptance. She slept again, deeper this time, the kind of sleep where your body takes control and forces repairs whether you're ready or not. Days blurred together, maybe weeks. Time stopped meaning anything in the forest where sunlight was filtered and rationed and night came on like a predator. The Veilborn hunted. She ate, her wounds closed, slowly, wrong. The infection should have killed her, the fever should have cooked her brain, but the mark burned hotter than either, and whatever it was doing to her, it was keeping her alive, changing her. She started to notice things, her senses sharpening in ways that defied explanation. She could smell the deer before the Veilborn brought it, could hear things moving in the forest that should have been too far away or too quiet to register, could see in the dark almost as well as in light, her eyes adjusting to shadow in ways that felt fundamentally wrong but worked. And the mark. Christ, the mark. It had spread. No longer just the runic scar on her shoulder blade. It crawled down her spine now, branching out like roots or veins or something alive that was mapping her nervous system. When she touched it, she could feel things. The forest. The creatures in it. The Veilborn standing watch. A network. A connection. Pack. Her body was changing too. The soft edges that palace life had left on her were burning away, replaced by muscle that felt denser than it should be. Her hands had hardened into something between flesh and weapon, nails growing thicker, fingertips calloused in patterns that looked almost like scales. She caught a reflection in the stream one morning and didn't recognize herself. The girl who had walked up those palace steps in silk and hope was gone. Something leaner looked back, hungrier. Eyes that caught light wrong, throwing back that faint red glow when the angle was right. Not quite human anymore. Not quite Veilborn either. Something in between. One night she finally asked the question that had been building since the creature first sat down instead of tearing her apart. "Why?" she said into the dark. "Why help me?" The Veilborn turned its massive head. Those red eyes found hers. And again, not words, just meaning pouring through the mark. Images, emotions, concepts that language couldn't quite hold, because you are becoming what we serve, because the old pact stirs, because alpha calls to alpha, and you reek of it even broken. She sat with that, tried to parse it into something that made sense. "I'm not an alpha," she said. "I'm nothing. Cast out. Rejected. Damaged goods, remember?" The Veilborn made that rumbling sound again, almost like laughter. "A king names himself alpha because others fear him," it said through the mark. "A true alpha becomes one because survival demands it. You did not ask the forest for mercy. You did not beg the dark to spare you. You crawled into us bleeding and broken and demanded we watch you live anyway. That is alpha." She wanted to argue, wanted to explain that she was just stubborn, just too angry to die. That there was nothing special about refusing to quit when quitting meant Draven won. But the mark pulsed, and she felt it. The truth underneath the words. She had changed. Was changing. The girl who walked into the palace in silk and hope was dead. Something else was being forged in this forgotten place where only predators survived. Something that didn't ask for crowns. Something that took them. 3 months into the forest, the first patrol came. She smelled them half a mile out. Sweat and leather, and the particular stink of men who thought violence made them powerful. 7 of them. Lycan warriors in the king's colors, pushing into the blackwood like they owned it. The Veilborn growled, a sound that made the trees shiver. She put a hand on its flank, felt the muscle coiled beneath fur, the barely restrained need to tear and break and feed. "Wait," she said. It obeyed. Because somewhere in the last 3 months, without ceremony or declaration, she had become what it recognized as authority. She moved through the trees, silent. The mark had taught her that, how to step where the forest welcomed her, how to breathe in rhythm with the dark, how to become part of the violence instead of its victim. The hunters made camp in a clearing, confident, stupid, fire burning bright enough to destroy their night vision. Laughing, drinking, telling stories about women they had ruined and towns they had burned. She listened from the shadows. One of them was talking about the rejected queen, about how she had screamed when the king pronounced judgment, how pathetic she looked crawling down the steps, how the whole court had laughed. He was lying. She hadn't screamed, hadn't begged, had taken the rejection in silence because giving them the satisfaction of her pain would have been another kind of death. But they needed the story to be about weakness, about a woman broken by a man's will, because that confirmed everything they believed about power. "You hear what happened to her," the liar said, taking a long pull from his flask. "Dead in a ditch somewhere, probably. Or worse." "Worse how?" another asked. The liar grinned. "Forest took her. You know what lives out here? Things that don't kill quick, things that like to play with their food. They all laughed. The sound echoed wrong in the clearing. Good riddance, another one said. King's better off. Can't build an empire on flawed bloodlines. Should have tested her better before wasting everyone's time. Should have just killed her, a third voice added. Would have been kinder. More laughter. She stepped into the firelight. The laughter stopped like someone had cut its throat. 7 sets of eyes snapped to her. Hands went to weapons. Steel rasped as swords cleared scabbards. The one who had been lying stood, tall, scarred, the kind of man who had built his identity on being feared. Well, he said, but his voice had lost its confidence. Look what the forest coughed up. You lost, girl? She didn't answer, just studied them, counted exits, measured distances, calculated angles. The mark pulsed, feeding her information she shouldn't have been able to access. Heart rates, breathing patterns, where each man's weight was balanced, which one would move first. The leader's grin faltered. Something in her eyes, something in the way she stood. No fear, no submission, just assessment, like they were prey and she was deciding if they were worth the effort. I asked you a question, he said. Less confident now. You deaf or just stupid? She smiled. It didn't reach her eyes. I was neither, she said. Her voice had changed. Lower, rougher, like rocks grinding. But you were right about one thing. His hand tightened on his sword. What's that? The forest did cough something up. Just not what you think. He opened his mouth to respond, to command, to assert the dominance he thought was his birthright. She moved first. The distance between them evaporated. 5 feet crossed in a heartbeat. Her hand, clawed now. When did that happen? Caught him by the throat before his sword cleared its arc. She lifted him off his feet like he weighed nothing, muscles that shouldn't exist rippling under skin that had forgotten how to be soft. His eyes went wide. Terror replacing arrogance. The sword fell from his fingers. You said the king was better off, she said. Her voice carried across the clearing. That I was a waste of time. That killing me would have been kinder. She squeezed. Not enough to crush, just enough to close his airway. Let him feel death approaching. The other 6 rushed her as a unit, training overriding fear, good tactics, overwhelming force. She threw their leader at them. 300 pounds of muscle and armor and terror, airborne, crashing into his own men. Bodies tangled, weapons clattered. The Veilborn hit them from behind. 8 feet of muscle and claw and hunger that had been waiting for permission. It took 2 of them down before they could turn. Sounds of tearing, screaming, the wet work of predation. The remaining 3 backed up, fear replacing confidence. 1 tried to run. She caught him in 4 strides, slammed him against a tree hard enough to crack bark. His sword fell. He scrabbled for a knife. She caught his wrist, squeezed. Bones ground. The knife dropped. Please, he gasped. Please, I didn't. We were just following orders. The king said. The king, she repeated. What did the king say about me? That you were nothing, that you didn't matter, that we should forget you existed. She leaned in close. Let him see what the forest had made her, what rejection had forged. Her eyes caught the firelight and threw it back red. Go back, she said. Tell him you found me. Tell him what I've become. Tell him the nothing he threw away is coming for everything he has. She released him. He fell, scrambled backward, stared at her like she was the monster in children's stories. Run, she said. He ran, crashing through undergrowth. Gone. She turned back to the clearing. The Veilborn was feeding. The other bodies were still, cooling, becoming part of the forest like everything else that died here. The leader was still alive. Barely. Crawling, leaving a blood trail, trying to reach a sword that was too far away. She walked over, crouched down, met his eyes. You were wrong, she said. Killing me wouldn't have been kinder. It would have been smarter. She stood, walked away. Let him bleed out slow. Let him understand what it felt like to be discarded, to be nothing. Behind her, the Veilborn continued feeding. The fire burned low, and somewhere in the distance, running footsteps faded toward the empire that thought forgetting her was enough. 6 months in the forest, and she stopped being surprised when the Veilborn came. They arrived one by one at first, then in pairs, then in packs, drawn by something they sensed through whatever ancient network connected them. The alpha call, the recognition of hierarchy that predators understood bone deep. She didn't command them, didn't need to. They simply knew. When she moved, they moved. When she hunted, they hunted. When she sat in silence watching the canopy, they formed a perimeter and waited. Pack. Her body had completed its transformation. The mark covered her entire back now, spiraling down her arms in patterns that shifted when she wasn't looking directly at them. Her muscles had been recarved by constant movement and survival. Lean, hard, built for violence. Her eyes caught light wrong now, throwing back that same red glow as the Veilborn when the shadows hit right. She had become something the Dominion didn't have words for, something that shouldn't exist but did anyway. The hunter she'd sent running had made it back. She knew because the patrols increased, heavily armed units pushing into the forest borders, searching, hunting, trying to confirm the impossible story their traumatized scout had brought home. She picked them off one by one. Never the whole patrol. Just one man. The quietest kill possible. Dragged into the trees. Vanished, leaving the others to imagine what got him. Fear was a weapon. Terror was better. And she was building both with surgical precision. By the 8th month, the patrols stopped coming. By the 9th, she was ready. She stood at the forest's edge on a moonless night, looking out at the Dominion sprawling in the distance. The empire that had tested her, chosen her, rejected her, thrown her away like garbage. The Veilborn gathered behind her, dozens now, maybe hundreds. Hard to count in the dark. They waited for her decision. She could stay here. Build something in the forgotten places. Become a myth that scared children and soldiers. The monster in the Blackwood. The thing that killed the king's men. Safe. Hidden. Alive. Or she could do what the mark was demanding. What her blood was screaming for. What every cell in her body had been preparing for since the moment her skull cracked against marble. She could go home. The city lights glittered, innocent, unaware, believing themselves protected by walls and soldiers and the king's absolute authority. One of the Veilborn moved beside her. The first one, the one who'd found her bleeding and broken and decided she was worth saving. It made that rumbling sound, a question without words. She touched the mark, felt it pulse, felt the network of predators connected to her, waiting for direction, felt the forest itself holding its breath. And she smiled. Not the diplomatic smile they'd taught her in the palace, not the submissive smile expected of queens, the smile of something that had died and come back wrong, that had been broken and rebuilt itself sharper, the smile of a hunter looking at prey that didn't know it was already dead. Yeah, she said to the Veilborn, to the forest, to the empire that thought forgetting her was enough. Let's go make them remember. The mark flared. The Veilborn moved as one, a wave of fur and claw and hunger pouring out of the tree line like a flood finally breaking through a dam. And in the distance, in the palace where King Draven Kaelor sat on his obsidian throne, convinced his judgment was final, the first watchtower went dark. Then the second. Then screaming started. The outer wall sentries died without understanding what killed them. One moment they were making their rounds, bored, comfortable, believing the Blackwood was too far away to threaten the capital. The next, shadows with red eyes were among them, and their screams were cut short before they could warn anyone. Aelyra walked behind the wave, unhurried, inevitable. The city gate stood before her, massive constructs of iron and stone designed to repel armies. She raised her hand. The Veilborn hit the gates like a battering ram made of muscle and fury. Metal shrieked, stone cracked, and the gates that had never fallen, that represented the Empire's impregnability, buckled. Inside, alarm bells started ringing. Too late. The gates collapsed inward. And Aelyra Voss, the rejected queen, the damaged goods, the nothing that had been thrown away, walked through the ruins into the Empire that had tried to erase her. Behind her, the Blackwood forest stood silent, waiting. Because this was just the beginning. And what came next would teach the Dominion a lesson it would never forget. Some things, when you break them, don't stay broken. They evolve. The Dominion's capital had never fallen. Not in 3 centuries. Not through siege, not through subterfuge, not through the countless rebellions that rose and broke like waves against its walls. The city had stood because it represented something absolute. The king's will made manifest in stone and steel, and the bones of those who challenged it. That absolutism died the moment the gates collapsed. Elira walked through the wreckage into chaos. The outer district burned, not the wild, uncontrolled burn of accident, but surgical fires set to create panic, to drive people inward, to turn the city into a funnel with only one way out. Toward the palace. Toward Draven. The Veilborn moved through the streets like smoke-given teeth, not killing indiscriminately. Selective. Precise. Soldiers died. Guards died. Anyone wearing the king's colors became meat. But civilians who ran, who hid, who pressed themselves against walls and prayed to survive, the Veilborn flowed around them like water around stones. This wasn't slaughter, it was surgery, cutting out the apparatus of control while leaving the body of the Empire intact enough to witness what came next. Because Elira didn't want subjects. She wanted witnesses. The first real resistance came at the inner wall. A battalion of Lycon elite, armored in that black steel that drank light, formed a shield wall across the main avenue. Behind them, archers lined the battlements. Ballistas tracked movement in the burning streets. Their commander stood at the center of the formation, Captain Ren Voltar. She recognized him. Had danced with him once at a pre-coronation banquet, back when she was the chosen queen and he was a rising officer trying to curry favor. He didn't recognize her now. "Halt!" he shouted. His voice carried the authority of a man who'd spent his life being obeyed. "In the name of King Draven Kalor, you will cease this attack and submit to—" She raised her hand. The Veilborn stopped. A wall of fur and muscle and barely restrained violence, freezing in perfect unison. The silence that followed was louder than the screaming had been. Ren's confidence flickered, just for a second, long enough for doubt to crack the professional soldier facade. Elira stepped forward, out of the shadows, into the light of the burning buildings. Recognition hit him like a fist. His face went white. "No," he said. "Not possible. You're dead." The king said. She kept walking, 20 feet between them, 15, 10. "The king said a lot of things," she replied. Her voice carried without effort, pitched to reach every soldier on that wall. "He said I was flawed. He said I was nothing. He said the Empire should forget I existed. 5 feet now, close enough to see the sweat on Ren's face, close enough to smell the fear bleeding through his armor. How's that working out for him?" Ren's hand went to his sword, training overriding reason. Draw, engage, defend. She caught his wrist before the blade cleared leather. Her grip, clawed fingers that looked wrong in the firelight, crushed steel bracers like paper. Bones ground. The sword fell. "I danced with you once," she said. "Do you remember?" His face contorted. Pain. Terror. The fundamental wrongness of a world where rejected queens came back as predators. "You were kind to me that night," she continued. "Didn't try to grope me like the others. Didn't whisper propositions when Draven wasn't looking. You treated me like I mattered." She released him. He stumbled back, cradling his ruined wrist. "So I'm giving you a choice, Captain. Something no one gave me. You can stand here and die for a king who'd throw you away the moment you stopped being useful. Or you can step aside and live to see what comes next." Behind him, the shield wall wavered, soldiers looking at each other, calculating, wondering if loyalty was worth dying for. This is the fundamental truth about authority that tyrants never grasp. It only works as long as people believe in it. The moment doubt enters, the moment survival instinct overrides ideology, the whole structure becomes sand. Ren looked at his men, at the Veilborn waiting in perfect stillness, at Elira, who had walked through fire and rejection and death itself to stand here. He stepped aside. "Fall back," he ordered. His voice cracked. "All units, fall back to the palace perimeter." Half the battalion obeyed immediately. The other half hesitated, caught between training and self-preservation. Then they saw the Veilborn move, just a ripple of muscle and claw, and the decision made itself. The shield wall collapsed. Soldiers retreated in controlled panic, maintaining formation but abandoning their posts. The inner wall stood empty. Elira walked through. The Veilborn followed. And behind them, the outer city burned. Mogged. News of the breach reached the throne room like a contagion. Messengers stumbling over each other. Reports contradicting. Panic spreading through the court like blood in water. Draven sat on his obsidian throne and listened with the stillness of a predator calculating angles. He didn't interrupt, didn't rage, didn't demand executions, just absorbed information with the cold efficiency that had made him the most feared ruler in 3 generations. When the last messenger finished, silence filled the hall. The assembled nobles and generals and advisors waited for the explosion, for the king to unleash the fury that everyone knew was coming. It didn't come. "How many?" Draven asked. His voice was conversational, almost pleasant. The messenger swallowed. "My king, the reports are unclear. At least 50 of the creatures, maybe more. They move in the dark and—" "Not the beasts," Draven interrupted. "How many of my soldiers defected?" The messenger's face went pale. That is, Captain Wren and his battalion withdrew without—" "How many defected?" Each word carved from ice. The messenger's knees buckled. 200, my king, maybe 3. The inner wall garrison stands ready, but the outer forces— "Get out!" The messenger fled. The doors boomed shut behind him. Draven stood. The movement drew every eye in the room. He descended from the throne with the measured pace of a man who had never rushed for anything in his life. Korvax stepped forward from his position by the pillar. "My king, I can take the remaining battalions and—" "No." Korvax stopped. Waited. This is the paradox of absolute power. It makes you untouchable right up until the moment it makes you completely alone. Draven had spent his reign eliminating anyone who could challenge him, crushing dissent, ensuring that no one in his court was strong enough to threaten his throne. But strength in isolation becomes brittleness, and brittle things shatter. "She's coming for me," Draven said. "Not the city, not the empire. Me. Yes, my king, because I rejected her. Yes, my king." Draven turned, met Korvax's eyes, and in that moment something passed between them. Recognition, maybe, or realization. "You warned me," Draven said. "Do you remember? The night of the rejection, you said the mark had taken, that severing the bond might have consequences." Korvax said nothing. "You said some bloodlines don't break clean, that forcing a separation after the mark bonded could trigger something in her, something old, something we didn't understand. I advised caution, my king." Draven laughed. No humor in it, just acknowledgement of irony so sharp it cut. "I thought I was correcting a mistake, removing a flaw before it contaminated the empire. But what I actually did was create the only thing in this world that could destroy me." He walked to the window, looked out at his burning city, at the smoke rising like offerings to gods who didn't care. Here's what kings never admit, even to themselves. They don't fear rebellion, don't fear armies or assassins or plots hatched in shadows. Those are external threats, manageable. You crush them and move on. What they fear is consequence, the idea that their actions might create something they can't control. That power, when applied with absolute certainty, might forge its own nemesis. Draven had rejected Aelira because her bloodline showed markers of instability, because the geneticists had found anomalies, because continuing the bond risked offspring who might be flawed, and flawed heirs meant weakness in the succession. It was the rational choice, the strategic choice, the choice any ruler who valued empire over sentiment would make. But rationality doesn't account for variables you don't know exist. And the mark, the ancient binding that designated queens, hadn't been fully understood in centuries. It was tradition, ceremony, a scar that proved worthiness. Except it wasn't just a scar, it was a trigger. And Draven had pulled it the moment he severed the bond, flooding Aelira's system with whatever dormant power the mark carried, activating something that evolution had buried in certain bloodlines for reasons lost to time. He had tried to discard weakness and instead unleashed apex. "Assemble the Praetorian Guard," Draven said. "Every available soldier to the throne room. Fortify the approaches. Seal the palace." Korvax bowed. "It will be done, my king." "And Korvax?" "Yes, my king. When she breaks through, not if when, I want you gone. Take the succession documents and the imperial seal. Get them to the southern stronghold. My king, I cannot abandon—" "You can and you will, because if I fall tonight, the empire needs to survive. Someone has to rebuild, someone who understands what we're facing." Korvax stood rigid, loyalty warring with pragmatism. Finally, he nodded. As you command, my king. He left. The doors closed. Draven stood alone in his throne room, surrounded by the trappings of absolute power, and felt the first cold touch of something he hadn't experienced in 20 years. Fear. Not for his life. Death was just an ending. He'd made peace with mortality long ago. Fear that everything he'd built, the empire, the order, the legacy, might not survive what he'd created. Elira reached the palace district as midnight bled into the dead hours. The streets here were empty. No civilians, no refugees, just soldiers in formation, barricades reinforced with steel and spiked wood, archers on every roof, the Praetorian Guard, the elite, the ones who'd never broken, never retreated, never questioned. They stood in perfect silence as she approached. 300 men in black armor, weapons drawn, waiting. At their center, Commander Cale Thorne. Gray beard, scar tissue where his left eye used to be. 40 years of service etched into his face like a map of violence. He recognized her. She could see it in the way his jaw tightened. Lady Voss, he said, the title heavy with things unsaid. You've come a long way from the palace steps. She stopped 20 feet from their line. The Veilborn spread out behind her, a crescent of predators filling the avenue. I'm not Lady Voss anymore, Commander. That girl died when your king threw her away. Thorne nodded slowly. Maybe she did. Maybe something else stands here now. But that doesn't change my duty. Your duty, she repeated. To protect a king who'd sacrifice you the moment it served him? Yes. The honesty hit different than she expected. No posturing, no ideology, just a soldier who'd chosen his side and would die on it. I respect that, she said. And because I do, I'll make this quick. She moved. The distance evaporated. 20 feet crossed before Thorne could react. Her hand caught his sword mid-swing, claws grinding against steel, stopping the blade dead. His eye widened. Not possible. The strength required to halt a broadsword one-handed defied physics. She ripped the weapon from his grip and threw it aside. Your turn, she said. The Praetorian Guard attacked as one. 300 trained killers coordinating like a single organism. Spears thrust, swords fell, arrows flew from the rooftops in a steel rain. The Veilborn met them head-on. What followed wasn't a battle. Battles have front lines and tactics and the possibility of retreat. This was collision. Two forces meeting with such violence that the space between them ignited. Elira fought in the center. Not leading, not commanding, just fighting. Her body moved with a precision that came from the mark, from the network connecting her to the pack, from months of evolution in the forest where hesitation meant death. She broke through the first rank, claws tearing through armor, strength that shouldn't exist shattering shields, speed that made her invisible between heartbeats. A spear grazed her ribs. She caught the shaft, yanked the wielder forward, drove her elbow through his faceplate. Bone cracked. He fell. Another soldier flanked her. Good instincts, quiet approach. Blade aimed for the spine. She spun, caught his wrist, twisted until joints separated. Used his body as a shield against the 3 arrows meant for her heart. Let him drop, kept moving. This is the reality of violence that stories soften. It's not elegant, not heroic, just meat and bone and the mechanical application of force until one side stops moving. The Praetorian Guard died hard. They died well. Every single one fought to the last breath, maintaining formation even as their ranks collapsed, covering each other's retreats, making Elira earn every foot of ground. But determination doesn't stop evolution, and what she'd become was beyond their training to handle. When it ended, Thorne was the last one standing, blood running from a dozen wounds, sword arm broken, but still upright, still between her and the palace. Stand down, Commander, she said. You've done your duty. You don't have to die for it. He smiled, blood on his teeth. Yes, Lady Voss, I do. He charged. She killed him clean, fast. One strike that took his head off before his nervous system could register pain. Respect for an enemy meant not making them suffer. She stepped over his body. The palace gate stood before her. Massive constructs of reinforced steel, sealed from the inside. The Veilborn moved forward, began tearing at the metal with claws that carved through it like flesh. Behind those gates, Draven waited, and between them, the final barrier was crumbling. Draven heard the gates fall. The sound echoed through the palace like a death knell. Systematic. Inevitable. He sat on his throne. Alone now. The court had evacuated hours ago. The servants fled. Even Korvax was gone, following orders, carrying the succession documents that would matter if Alyra decided to let the Empire survive. The throne room doors were sealed. 4 inches of reinforced ironwood barred from the inside. It would buy minutes, maybe less. He waited. Footsteps in the corridor, light, measured, unhurried. Not the heavy tread of armored soldiers, something leaner. The doors buckled. Once. Twice. On the third impact, the bar shattered. The doors exploded inward, torn from their hinges. Alyra walked through the wreckage into the throne room where everything had begun. She looked different. Not just the physical changes, the claws, the eyes, the muscle carved by survival. Something deeper. The way she moved, the way she held herself. Like gravity worked differently for her now, like she'd stopped being subject to the world and become its predator. Draven stood, descended from the throne with the same measured pace he'd used the night he rejected her. Authority maintained even at the end. They faced each other across the blood-stained marble, 30 feet apart, close enough to see every detail, far enough that what came next would have room to breathe. "You came back," Draven said. His voice carried no surprise, just acknowledgement. "Did you think I wouldn't?" "I thought you'd die. The forest, the exile, the wounds. By every rational measure, you should have died." She smiled, that smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Rational measures don't account for rage, my king, or spite, or the particular kind of fuel that comes from being told you're nothing." Draven nodded slowly. "I underestimated you. I see that now. The bloodline markers we found, they weren't flaws. They were dormant potential. Breaking the bond activated them." "Yes. And everything that happened after, the survival, the transformation, the army you built, that was the consequence of my decision." Yes, he absorbed that, processed it with the same clinical detachment he applied to everything. "If I had known," he said, "I would have killed you outright, quick, clean, before the mark could trigger." "I know. Does that change anything?" "No." She started walking, slow, each step deliberate, closing the distance with the inevitability of tide. "You need to understand something," Draven said. "He didn't draw a weapon, didn't move, just spoke. I didn't reject you out of cruelty. It was strategy. The Empire requires genetic stability. Your bloodline showed anomalies. Continuing the bond risked—" "Risked what?" she interrupted. 20 feet between them now. Heirs who might be different, who might evolve past your control? Yes. So you threw me away to protect your power, 15 feet. I threw you away to protect the Empire. There's a difference. Is there? 10 feet. She stopped. Let the question hang. Here's the truth Draven had spent 20 years avoiding. He'd built an empire on control, on ensuring that every variable was accounted for, every threat neutralized, every element of uncertainty removed. It had made him powerful, untouchable. It had also made him brittle, because control is just another word for fear. Fear of chaos, fear of the unknown, fear that if you let go for even a moment, everything you've built will collapse. And that fear had driven every decision, including the one that created his destroyer. "You want me to say I was wrong," Draven said. "That rejecting you was a mistake, that I should have trusted the bond." Alyra tilted her head. "Do I? Don't you? Isn't that what this is about, proving that I was wrong to discard you?" She laughed. The sound echoed wrong in the vast chamber. "No," she said. "This isn't about proving anything. This is about consequence. You made a choice. I became what that choice created. Now we both live with the result. 5 feet between them now." Draven's hand moved to his belt, not to a weapon, to something else. A vial. Glass filled with liquid that caught light like oil. "Do you know what this is?" he asked. She didn't answer. Dissolution compound. Breaks down biological matter at the molecular level. Painless. Fast. Gone in minutes. I've carried it for years. Insurance against capture. Against torture. Against being used as a tool against the Empire. He held it up. "Let her see it clearly. If you kill me, the Empire fractures. Civil war. Succession battles. Everything I built collapses into chaos. Thousands die. Maybe millions. He uncorked the vial. But if I remove myself cleanly, leave clear succession, Korvax can stabilize things, minimize the damage, rebuild. He raised it to his lips. So you don't get to kill me, Elira. You don't get that satisfaction. You get to watch me deny you even that. She moved faster than thought, crossed the remaining distance, struck the vial from his hand. It shattered against marble, liquid hissing as it ate into stone. Her hand locked around his throat, lifted him off his feet. You don't get to escape, she said, her voice raw. You don't get to make this clean. You don't get to control how this ends. She carried him to the throne, slammed him down onto the obsidian seat that had defined his reign, held him there with one hand while the other carved lines into the armrest, claws grinding through stone. You're going to sit here, she said, and you're going to understand what you created. You're going to feel what it's like to have everything you are reduced to nothing. Draven met her eyes, no fear in his face now, just curiosity. And maybe, buried deep, something like respect. What are you? He asked. She leaned close enough that he could see the red glow in her eyes, close enough to smell the forest and blood and evolution on her skin. I'm what happens when you break something that refuses to stay broken, she said. I'm the consequence you didn't plan for, the variable you didn't account for. She released him, stepped back. I'm the Empire's next ruler, whether you or it wants me or not. Draven slumped in the throne, breathing hard, looking at her with something between horror and admiration. The Empire will never accept you, he said. You're not chosen, not sanctioned, not— I don't need to be chosen, she interrupted. I just need to be inevitable. She turned, walked toward the shattered doors. The Veilborn waited in the corridor beyond, red eyes glowing in the dark. What are you going to do? Draven called after her. She paused, looked back. I'm going to give the Empire a choice, she said. Bow to something new, or burn with something old. She left him there, alive, broken. Everything he'd built crumbling around him, because killing him would have been mercy. And she'd learned from the Master that mercy was weakness. Dawn broke over the Dominion to find its capital in ruins. Not destroyed, not conquered. Something worse, transformed. The Veilborn held every gate, every wall, every strategic position, not as occupiers, as guardians of something new. Elira stood on the palace balcony where Draven used to address his subjects, the same balcony where she'd stood months ago as his chosen queen, believing she understood power. Below, the city gathered. Not because soldiers forced them, because they needed to understand what happened, what changed, what came next. She let them wait, let the anticipation build, let them see the Veilborn standing sentinel, let them process that the impossible had occurred. Then she spoke. Her voice carried without amplification. The mark did that now, connected her to the space itself, made her words reach every ear. I was chosen to be your queen, she said, then rejected as flawed, thrown away as damaged goods, left to die because I didn't fit the perfect vision of what this empire demanded. Silence below. Thousands of faces staring up. But I didn't die. And what I became in that survival is standing before you now, not asking for your acceptance, not begging for legitimacy, just existing, inevitable, real, movement in the crowd, whispers spreading. Your king made a choice, she continued. He looked at something he didn't understand and decided destruction was safer than risk. And in doing so, he created the very thing he feared. She leaned forward. Let them see her clearly. The changes, the power, the wrongness that had become right. So now you have a choice. You can cling to the old order, the one where kings demand perfection and discard anything that doesn't conform, where power flows from fear and control and the erasure of anything different. She gestured to the Veilborn. To the city they now held. Or you can accept what's real, that evolution doesn't ask permission, that sometimes what you break comes back stronger, that the future doesn't wait for you to be ready. The crowd shifted. Some faces showed anger, others fear, but most showed something else. Curiosity. The fundamental human reaction to change, not acceptance, not rejection, just the need to see what comes next. I'm not your chosen queen, Aelira said. I'm what became necessary when your chosen queen was thrown away. I'm the consequence of a system that demands conformity and punishes difference. She straightened. And I'm claiming this throne. Not because I want it, not because I deserve it, because I'm what happens when you try to erase something that refuses to disappear. She turned, walked back into the palace. Let them process. Let them decide. Let them understand that the world had shifted, and all their opinions about whether it should have didn't matter. It already had. Sung. In the throne room, Draven still sat on the obsidian seat. He hadn't moved, hadn't fled, just waited. Aelira approached, stood before the throne. They looked at each other. Creator and creation, king and consequence. The empire is yours, Draven said. His voice was hollow, empty of everything except acknowledgement. What you do with it is your burden now. Not mine, she corrected. Ours. He frowned. What? You're not dying tonight, she said. You're going to live. You're going to watch what I build. You're going to see whether the thing you created destroys everything or transforms it into something better. That's crueler than death. I know. I learned from you. She walked to the throne, stood beside it. Not sitting, not claiming, just present. Here's what happens now, she said. You remain king in title, but I rule in fact. Every decision runs through me. Every policy, every judgment. You become the face that makes this transition easier for people to accept while I remake everything behind it. Draven absorbed that, calculated angles, saw the pragmatism, and if I refuse, then the empire fractures into civil war and millions die, which you claim to care about preventing. His jaw tightened. Checkmate delivered with his own logic. Why keep me alive, he asked. Why not just take it all? Because killing you makes me a conqueror, she said. Keeping you alive and powerless makes me something more dangerous. It makes me inevitable. It shows the empire that even its greatest king bows to evolution. She leaned down, met his eyes at level. And because every time you see me on this throne, you'll remember that you created this, that your fear of the unknown gave birth to the very thing you tried to prevent. That control is an illusion, and trying to enforce it just creates the chaos you were trying to avoid. That's the lesson you want me to learn? No, she said. That's the lesson I want the empire to learn. You're just the monument to it. She stood, walked to the balcony doors, paused. Oh, and Draven? Yes? If you try to kill yourself again, I'll have the Veilborn keep you alive. Fed through tubes, conscious, watching, for as long as it takes for you to accept that you don't get to escape consequence. She left him there, alive, broken, bearing witness to the new world he'd accidentally created. Outside, the sun rose higher, the city stirred, and the Dominion began the slow, painful process of understanding that power had shifted, not through conquest, through evolution, and the girl they'd thrown away had come back as the force they could never have prepared for. The one who didn't ask for permission, who didn't beg for acceptance, who simply became inevitable and made the world adjust. The first 3 weeks of the new order passed in an illusion of stability. Aelira held court in the throne room while Draven sat beside her like a monument to his own defeat, speaking when directed, confirming her edicts with the hollow authority of a puppet king. The Veilborn maintained order in the streets, their presence enough to prevent riots but measured enough to avoid massacre. The Empire, shocked into compliance, bent its knee and waited to see what came next. What came next was betrayal. It started small. Details that didn't align, reports that contradicted. Minor officials who should have been cooperative suddenly turning obstructive. Nothing overt. Nothing you could point to and call treason. Just friction. Resistance. The slow grinding of gears that should have meshed smoothly. Aelira noticed on day 18. She was reviewing grain distribution reports in the archives when the numbers stopped making sense. Shipments logged as delivered that never reached their destinations. Warehouses marked as full that inspection revealed half empty. Money allocated for reconstruction vanishing into administrative black holes. Someone was stealing, systematically, carefully. Using the chaos of transition as cover, she brought it to Korvax. He'd stayed on as her chief administrator, the practical choice given his knowledge of how the empire actually functioned. Without him, the bureaucracy would have ground to a halt. She'd trusted that pragmatism would outweigh loyalty to the deposed king. First mistake. Korvax reviewed the documents she placed before him with the careful attention of a man who knew exactly what he was looking at because he'd designed the system being exploited. Supply chain issues, he said. His voice carried the patient tone of someone explaining obvious things to the naive. The transition disrupted normal operations. It'll stabilize once. The numbers are too clean, she interrupted. Too systematic. This isn't disruption. This is theft. His eyes met hers. Flat, calculating, running scenarios. What are you suggesting, my lady? I'm suggesting someone is using the chaos to embezzle, and I need you to find out who. He took the documents, nodded. Of course. I'll investigate immediately. She should have seen it then, the way his hands didn't shake, the way his breathing stayed level, the complete absence of surprise or outrage that should have accompanied the revelation of massive theft from imperial coffers. She should have seen it, didn't. Second mistake. Because here's what every conqueror learns too late about power. Taking the throne is the easy part, the dramatic part, the part where strength and will and the ability to break things determines outcomes. But holding the throne requires something completely different. It requires knowing which levers to pull, which systems to maintain, which people to trust with the 10,000 invisible mechanisms that keep civilization from collapsing into chaos. And Alira didn't know any of that. She'd fought her way to the top of a structure she didn't understand, surrounded by people whose loyalty was a question she couldn't answer, dependent on expertise she didn't possess. She was apex predator in an environment where being the strongest thing in the room meant almost nothing. Because empires aren't held by strength. They're held by competence. And competence takes decades to build. She had weeks. 3 days later, Korvax reported back. He'd found the culprit, a mid-level administrator named Thalin Vex, who'd been skimming funds and falsifying records. The evidence was comprehensive, damning, airtight, too airtight. She had Vex brought to the throne room. The man was terrified, sweating through his bureaucrat's robes, stammering denials that sounded exactly like what guilty men say when caught. I never, someone set me up. Please, my lady, I'm loyal. She let him talk, watched his fear, smelled the genuine panic rolling off him in waves. And something clicked. This man wasn't a thief. He was a patsy, set up to take blame, sacrificed to close an investigation before it could trace back to the real architect. She looked at Korvax standing at attention by the pillar. Same position he'd held for Draven, same professional neutrality, same absolute control. Release him, she said. Korvax's expression didn't change. My lady, the evidence, I said release him. Vex scrambled out. Guards hauled him to his feet and dragged him away. The throne room emptied until only Alira, Draven, and Korvax remained. The silence stretched, pulled tight like wire about to snap. You want to tell me what's really happening? She asked. Korvax tilted his head slightly. I'm not sure what you mean, my lady. The theft, the falsified records. Vex was too convenient, too perfect a solution, which means someone handed him to me to stop me from looking deeper. And you think that someone was me? Was it? He smiled. Not broad, just enough to show teeth. You're very perceptive, my lady, he said. Draven always said you were smarter than you looked, so you admit it. I admit nothing. But hypothetically, if someone were siphoning resources from the Imperial Treasury, they'd need a very good reason, such as preparing for what comes next. The mark on her back flared, heat and warning. The Veilborn outside the throne room stirred, sensing her tension through the network. And what comes next, Korvax? He walked toward the throne. Not threatening, just closing distance, making his point through proximity. You broke the old order, he said, shattered it, left us with a queen who commands monsters and keeps the rightful king as a living trophy. Very dramatic, very impressive. He stopped at the base of the steps. But you're not a ruler, you're a force of nature. And forces of nature don't build empires. They destroy them. So someone needs to be ready for when this experiment collapses. Someone who can pick up the pieces and restore actual order. Alira stood, descended from the throne, met him at eye level. You're planning a coup. I'm planning for inevitability. You can't hold this empire with fear and monsters. Eventually, the people will rebel. The provinces will fracture. And when that happens, someone needs to step in who actually knows how to govern. So you're stealing resources to fund a shadow government. I'm preserving the empire's future. What you call theft, history will call salvation. The sheer audacity of it hit her like a physical force. He wasn't even hiding it, wasn't denying or deflecting, just stating facts with the confidence of a man who'd calculated every angle. And this is the thing about betrayal that stories never get right. It's not dramatic, not passionate, not driven by hatred or revenge or any of the emotions that make narrative sense. Real betrayal is cold, practical. A cost-benefit analysis that concludes your destruction is more valuable than your survival. Korvax didn't hate her. He just needed her gone. And he'd been working toward that goal since the moment she took the throne, smiling to her face while gutting her authority from behind. I could have the Veilborn tear you apart right now, she said. You could, but then you lose the only person who knows how to actually run this empire. The bureaucracy answers to me. The supply chains flow through systems I control. Kill me, and within a month you're presiding over famine and collapse. Checkmate delivered with the same cold logic Draven had used. She wanted to rage, to let the mark flare and unleash the pack, to show him what happened when you underestimated what she'd become. But he wasn't wrong. She'd conquered the capital, claimed the throne, but she didn't know how to feed a city of 2 million, didn't understand tax collection or trade agreements or the 1,000 administrative details that kept civilization running. She'd become apex predator in a world that still needed accountants. You're betting I need you more than I can afford to kill you, she said. I'm not betting, my lady. I'm stating facts. You have power. I have competence. Together, we can maintain stability. Apart, we both lose. And the theft? Stops immediately. My insurance policy was based on uncertainty, but now we understand each other. I'll serve faithfully as long as you keep the empire intact enough to be worth serving. It was extortion wrapped in pragmatism. A knife held to the empire's throat while offering to bandage the wound. And the worst part was it might actually work. Get out, she said. Korvax bowed. As you command, my lady. He left. The doors closed. Draven, who'd sat silent through the entire exchange, finally spoke. He played you, the former king said. His voice carried something that might have been sympathy or satisfaction at watching his successor face the same impossible choices. Made you choose between principles and practicality. Welcome to ruling. Shut up. You could kill him. Should kill him, probably, but then you're alone with an empire you don't know how to run. So you'll compromise, swallow the betrayal, tell yourself it's strategic, and every day after you'll wonder who else is planning for your inevitable fall. I said, shut up. This is what I tried to spare you from. The burden of the crown isn't the weight. It's the isolation. The knowledge that everyone around you is calculating their own survival, and you can't trust any of them. She turned on him, crossed the distance, grabbed him by the throat, and lifted him from the throne. You don't get to lecture me about burden. You created this. Every impossible choice I'm facing is because you were too afraid to accept something different. She threw him back. He hit the obsidian hard enough to crack it. And I'm not you. I won't let fear make me weak. She stalked out, left him bleeding, left the throne empty, left herself nowhere to go but forward into a trap she couldn't see yet. The revelation about Korvax should have been the warning, the sign that things were fracturing faster than she could control. But she was too focused on immediate threats to see the larger pattern, because while Korvax was stealing money, someone else was stealing loyalty. The Veilborn started disappearing on day 23, not dying, not fleeing, just vanishing. One would leave on patrol and never return. Another would be standing guard and be gone when the shift changed. No bodies, no signs of struggle, just absence. By day 26, she'd lost 40 of them. The mark should have told her, should have kept her connected to the pack through that ancient network. But the connection was getting fuzzy, static where there should have been clarity, like something was interfering with a signal she'd thought was unbreakable. She felt them dying, not physically. Worse, she felt them becoming separate, distant. The bonds that made them hers fraying like rope left too long in salt water. And with each one that disappeared, she became a little more alone. This is the fundamental vulnerability of any hierarchy built on connection. It only works as long as the network holds. Sever enough threads, and the whole structure collapses. You're left standing at the center of something that used to be power, holding nothing but memory of what you commanded. She went to the one person who might understand what was happening. Draven's private library occupied the palace's eastern tower, 3 floors of forbidden knowledge collected over generations. Texts on the old bloodlines, the mark, the binding ceremonies, everything that tradition had preserved even when understanding was lost. She found him there, reading by candlelight, his broken body propped against cushions. "The mark is failing," she said without preamble. He looked up. Blood still crusted his lip from where she'd thrown him, but his eyes were clear, calculating. "Not failing," he said. "Being severed. That's not possible. The bond is permanent once it takes. Usually, yes. But there are ways. Old ways. Dangerous ones. Someone would need intimate knowledge of the binding ceremony, access to specific compounds, and a veil-born to experiment on." Horror crept up her spine. Someone's killing them, breaking the connection. Not killing. Unbinding. Severing their link to you. Once cut, they revert. Become what they were before the alpha call. Just predators. Uncontrolled. Why? He set down the book, met her eyes. Because an alpha without a pack is just a woman with claws. Strip away the veil-born and you're back to what you were on those palace steps. Alone, mortal, killable. Who has that knowledge? He smiled, bitter, knowing. Besides me? Only one person. The royal bloodkeeper. The one who performs the binding ceremonies. Who maintains the archives. Who would have access to everything needed to undo what was done. She felt the ground shift beneath her, pieces falling into place with the grinding inevitability of a trap closing. "Korvax," she said. Draven nodded. He was there for every ceremony, recorded every ritual. As my second, he witnessed things most people never see, including how the old bonds were broken when queens died or were replaced. So he's not just stealing money, he's dismantling my power base, systematically, efficiently, while you're distracted trying to learn how to govern. By the time you figure out how to run an empire, you won't have the strength to hold it. She wanted to scream, to break things, to unleash what she'd become on the man who'd been gutting her authority from the inside while smiling to her face. But rage was luxury, and she couldn't afford it. "How do I stop it?" she asked. Draven stood, walked to a shelf, pulled down a tome bound in something that looked uncomfortably like human skin. The unbinding requires physical contact with each veilborn and a compound derived from moon lotus. Rare. Difficult to cultivate. Only grows in the palace conservatory. Show me. The conservatory occupied the palace's southern wing, a glass cathedral of exotic plants maintained by an army of botanists. Moon lotus grew in the center pool, silver petals reflecting light like liquid metal. Alira stood in the doorway, watched the head botanist carefully harvesting blooms, placing them in a leather satchel with the precision of someone who'd done this 40 times before. The botanist who looked up and saw her wasn't surprised, wasn't afraid, just resigned. "How long?" Alira asked. "Since the beginning," the woman replied, her voice steady. "Committed. Korvax approached me the day you took the throne, said he needed insurance, that you were dangerous, unstable, that someone had to protect the empire from your inevitable collapse. And you believed him. I believed the empire couldn't survive being ruled by someone who doesn't understand how fragile civilization is, how much work it takes to keep people fed and safe and functioning." She set down the satchel, straightened, met Alira's eyes without flinching. "You think power comes from strength, from domination, from being the most dangerous thing in the room, but it doesn't. It comes from 10,000 invisible systems working in harmony. Water flowing, food growing, trade routes functioning, medicine distributed, disputes resolved. Take those away, and your monsters don't matter. The empire starves and burns whether you're strong or not." This was the betrayal that cut deeper than Korvax's, because this woman wasn't doing it for power or money or personal gain. She genuinely believed she was saving the empire from a ruler who would destroy it through incompetence. And the worst part was she might be right. Alira had spent months becoming something that could survive, could fight, could conquer, but she'd never learned how to build, how to maintain, how to be the boring, unglamorous thing that kept societies from eating themselves. She was revolution, but revolutions eventually have to govern, and governing required skills she didn't have. How many? Illyra asked. How many Veilborn has he unbound? 43. Tonight would have been 44. Where is he doing it? The old temple, underground, where the original binding ceremonies were performed. Illyra turned to leave. He'll kill you, the botanist called after her. Korvax isn't stupid. He knows you'll come eventually. He'll be ready. I know. Then why walk into it? Because the alternative is letting him win by slow erosion. And I'd rather die fighting than fade away wondering when the knife will finally drop. The botanist shook her head. That's exactly what he's counting on. You're predictable. All that strength, all that power, and you're still just reacting, still letting others set the terms, still playing the game they designed. Then what would you do? The woman smiled sadly. I'd learn. I'd swallow my pride and admit I don't know how to rule. I'd find people who do and actually listen to them instead of treating governance like another thing to conquer. Illyra stared at her, at the genuine conviction in her eyes. But you won't do that, the botanist continued, because that would require accepting you're not enough on your own, and your entire identity is built on refusing to accept limits. She picked up the satchel. So you'll go down there. You'll fight. Maybe you'll win. Maybe Korvax will die and I'll hang, and you'll maintain power for another few weeks. But eventually, someone else will realize the same thing, that you're strong but not sufficient, and they'll try again and again, until one of them succeeds or you become the very thing you overthrew. She walked past Illyra toward the door, paused. The tragedy isn't that you'll fail, my lady. It's that you could have succeeded if you'd been willing to be weak. She left. Illyra stood alone among the silver flowers, feeling the weight of truth she didn't want to acknowledge. Oak. The old temple sat beneath the palace foundations, carved from bedrock during the Empire's first century. The ceremonies had moved above ground generations ago, but the original chamber remained, sacred, forbidden, forgotten by everyone except those who studied history or planned coups. Illyra descended alone. The Veilborn wanted to follow. She'd ordered them to stay. This wasn't a fight you won with numbers. It was personal, intimate, the kind of confrontation that defined what came next. The stairs spiraled down through stone that predated memory. Torches burned in sconces that hadn't held flame in decades. Someone had prepared this space, made it ready. The chamber at the bottom was exactly what she expected. Circular, carved with symbols that hurt to look at too long. A stone altar at the center stained with substances she didn't want to identify. Korvax stood beside it. Not alone. 20 Veilborn surrounded him. Not hers. Older ones, wild ones. The kind that served no alpha because they'd never been called. Eyes that glowed red in the torchlight. Claws that scraped stone with sounds that set teeth on edge. And bound to the altar, unconscious, one of her pack. The 44th. Impressive, Illyra said, her voice echoing in the ancient space. You learned to control them without the mark. Control is the wrong word, Korvax replied. I simply reminded them what they were before you came along. Apex predators who don't need a master. Just direction. Just someone who understands that strength without purpose is just violence waiting to collapse inward. He held up a vial of silver liquid. The unbinding compound. This one is the last. Once I sever it from you, your pack drops below critical mass. The network collapses. You lose the connection entirely. And then? Then you're just a woman who's very strong and very angry. Still dangerous, but mortal, killable. And the Empire can return to being run by people who actually understand governance instead of predators playing at civilization. You really think you can kill me with 20 Veilborn? Korvax smiled. Cold, patient. The smile of someone who'd calculated every variable and found the outcome acceptable. I think you'll kill yourself trying. You've never learned restraint, never understood that some fights you walk away from. You'll throw everything you have at this, burn yourself out trying to save one creature, and when you're exhausted, they'll finish what I started. He uncorked the vial, began lowering it toward the bound Veilborn's mouth. Last chance to walk away, he said. Leave the throne, take what's left of your pack, disappear into the forest. Live, I'll even let you. I'm not cruel, just practical. And here it was, the choice that defined everything. Accept loss and survive diminished, or fight and risk everything for a victory that might not matter. She thought about the botanist's words, about being willing to be weak, about accepting limitations. Then she thought about those palace steps, about being thrown away like garbage, about crawling through darkness while the Empire celebrated her erasure, about refusing to stay broken. "No," she said. "Then you die here, and history forgets you ever existed." The vial touched the Veilborn's lips. The mark exploded, not with heat, with everything. Every connection, every thread of the network, every bond she'd built with the pack over months of survival and evolution and becoming something new. She didn't just feel them, she became them, and they became her. The bound Veilborn's eyes snapped open, jaws clamped shut, bit through glass, shattered the vial. Silver liquid sprayed. The creature broke its bonds like they were spider silk and lunged at Korvax in one fluid motion of pure coordinated rage. He stumbled back, shock cracking through his composed facade. The 20 wild Veilborn attacked, but they weren't coordinated, weren't connected, just individual predators following individual instincts against something that moved like it knew what they'd do before they did. Because through the mark, Alira felt them, read them, anticipated. Her Veilborn tore through 3 before they could adapt, used their bodies as shields, as weapons, as obstacles that turned their own pack into chaos. And Alira moved. She crossed the chamber like lightning finding ground. Korvax tried to run, pulled a blade from his coat. Some last desperate defense forged in the moment plan's collapse. She caught his wrist mid-swing, crushed it, felt bones grind to powder. The blade clattered on stone. "You were right about one thing," she said, her voice carrying over the sounds of Veilborn tearing each other apart. "I don't understand governance. Don't know how to run an empire. Don't have the knowledge to manage the systems that keep civilization functioning." She lifted him off his feet, slammed him against the altar hard enough to crack ribs, hard enough to drive air from lungs. "But I understand evolution. I understand that structures built on fear of change inevitably collapse. And I understand that the only way forward is through people who can adapt instead of people who cling to what was." His face contorted. Pain, terror, the fundamental wrongness of a world where his perfect plan had accounted for everything except the possibility that she'd become more than he'd calculated. "You can't kill me," he gasped, blood on his lips. "Without me, the Empire falls apart. I made sure of that. Built myself into every system until removing me meant breaking everything. You need me." She leaned close. Let him see what months of survival had made her eyes. "I know," she said. "You made yourself indispensable. Made it so I couldn't afford to lose you. Smart, efficient, exactly what someone who understood power would do." She released him. Let him drop. He hit the altar and crumpled. "But you made one mistake." He looked up, confused, bleeding, trying to understand where his perfect logic had failed. "You assumed I'd play by rules that say some people are too valuable to punish, that competence earns immunity, that being necessary means being safe." She knelt, met his eyes at level. "I don't play by those rules anymore. I make new ones." The mark flared, different this time, not connecting to Veilborn, reaching for him, for human neural architecture that was close enough to animal to accept the binding if you forced it hard enough. "What are you—" "No, you can't. It doesn't work on—" It shouldn't have worked. The mark was designed for creatures with pack instincts, with hierarchical structures already wired into their biology. Humans were too complex, too individual, too resistant, but Alira had months of practice forcing her will through the network, months of learning how to push the mark beyond its original design, months of becoming something that bent rules through sheer refusal to accept limitations. The binding took him screaming. It wasn't clean, wasn't designed for this. His mind fought it with everything consciousness could muster. Neurons firing in patterns meant to resist outside control, ego asserting itself against domination. None of it mattered. The mark carved through his resistance like water through sand. Rewrote neural pathways. Established hierarchy at a level below conscious thought. Turned his absolute certainty of intellectual superiority into absolute submission to her will. When it finished, he collapsed, breathing hard, eyes showing whites. Mind still intact but no longer entirely his own. "Stand," she commanded. He stood, not because he chose to, because she'd made it impossible not to. His body obeyed while his mind screamed helplessly behind eyes that couldn't look away from her. This was worse than death, worse than torture. To remain yourself but lose autonomy. To think and feel and understand while your body became someone else's tool. The wild Veilborn had stopped attacking. Sensing the shift, recognizing new hierarchy established through methods that shouldn't work but did. Go, she told them. Return to the forest. This isn't your fight anymore. They went, melting into shadows. Gone. She looked at Korvax, at what she'd made him, at the horror and awareness still present in his eyes. You wanted to preserve the Empire, she said, to make sure it survived my inevitable collapse. Fine. You'll get your wish, you'll serve. Use all that knowledge and competence to keep the systems running, but you'll do it because I command it, not because you choose it. She released the binding slightly. Let him speak. Let him have that much. This is worse than death, he whispered, voice raw, broken. I know. I learned from Draven. The cruelest punishment isn't ending someone, it's making them live with consequence, making them watch while everything they tried to prevent happens anyway, making them participate in their own worst nightmare. She walked toward the stairs, stopped. Oh, and Korvax? Every time you think about breaking free, every time you try to find a loophole in the binding, you'll fail. Because I'm not Draven. I don't rely on fear or tradition or the idea that people will obey because they always have. I change the rules. And under my rules, loyalty isn't chosen. It's mandatory. She left him there, broken, bound, useful, despite himself. The throne room was empty when she returned. Dawn light filtered through the windows, painting everything in shades of gold that felt like mockery. The city stirred beyond the palace walls. Life continuing, people waking, the Empire functioning because it always had, indifferent to whatever dramas played out in its heart. Draven sat on the steps below the throne, not in it, just near it, waiting. You bound him, he said. Not a question. Statement of fact delivered with the flat certainty of someone who'd felt the mark flare and understood exactly what she'd done. Yes, that's not how the mark is supposed to work. It's for Veilborn. Using it on humans crosses lines that were established for reasons. I know. Then why? Because he left me no choice. Because the alternative was letting him undermine everything until I failed. Because I'm tired of playing by rules designed to make me lose. She sat beside him, exhausted. The mark had burned through reserves she didn't know she had. Her hands shook. Vision blurred at the edges. The binding had cost more than killing him would have. But killing him would have been mercy. And she was done being merciful to people who saw kindness as weakness. I'm becoming the thing I hated, she said quietly. The thing you were. Using power to control, to dominate, to make people tools instead of letting them be people. Draven was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried something she'd never heard from him before. Something that might have been regret. The crown does that, he said. Forces you into choices where every option compromises something you value. You can be moral and watch the Empire collapse, or practical and become what you despised. There's no third path. Believe me, I looked. There has to be another way. If there is, I never found it, and I searched for 20 years. Tried every configuration of power and restraint, every balance between force and diplomacy, every compromise between ideals and reality. He turned to look at her. Really look. Not as enemy or prisoner, but as someone who'd walked the same path and knew where it led. You want to know the real joke? He asked. The thing that makes all of this futile? What? The Empire doesn't care. Doesn't matter if it's ruled by a tyrant or a revolutionary or something in between. The systems keep running. The people keep living. And whoever sits on this throne ends up making the same choices because the chair demands it. Because civilization itself is violence. Order imposed on chaos, structure forced onto humans who'd rather be free. So we're trapped. We're trapped, he agreed, building empires that demand monsters to run them, becoming monsters to maintain empires, around and around until someone stronger comes along and the cycle starts over. She wanted to argue. to insist that she'd find what he couldn't, that she'd build something different, that binding Korvax was a temporary necessity, not the first step toward becoming exactly what she'd overthrown. But sitting there in the dawn light, having just forced a man's will to hers forever, the argument felt hollow. Maybe that's the lesson, Draven continued. Not that power corrupts, but that the kind of power needed to hold an empire requires a specific kind of corruption. You can't rule millions through kindness, can't maintain order through suggestion. At some point, you have to make people obey. And making them obey means destroying the part of yourself that believes everyone deserves choice. He stood, offered her his hand. Welcome to the throne, my lady. Try not to hate yourself too much for what you'll become. It doesn't change anything, but it makes the nights longer. She didn't take his hand, stood on her own. Because even now, even knowing he was right, she couldn't accept help from him without it feeling like surrender. I'm not you, she said. Not yet. But give it time. The crown has a way of filing down edges until everyone who wears it looks the same. He walked away, left her alone with the obsidian throne that had claimed another idealist and turned them into exactly what they'd fought against. And in the growing light, Aelira Voss sat on that throne and felt the Empire's weight settle onto her shoulders like chains made of other people's lives and her own compromised principles. She'd won, claimed the throne, bound her enemies, secured her power, and lost something essential in the process. The mark pulsed. The Veilborn waited. The Empire stirred. And she understood with crushing clarity that this was just the beginning, that every day forward would be another choice between principles and survival, another compromise, another piece of who she was sacrificed to maintain what she'd built. The girl who crawled through the forest dying would have been horrified at what sat here now. The queen on the throne couldn't afford to care, because horror was luxury, and she'd learned the hardest way possible that luxury was the first thing power took from you. The messenger arrived at dawn on the 31st day, blood-soaked and barely conscious, carrying news that would fracture whatever remained of the fragile order Aelira had built. The outer provinces were burning, not from rebellion, not from uprising, from something worse, something coordinated, something that had been waiting for exactly this moment when the Empire's center was weakest, when its ruler was learning to govern instead of leading, when the transition had created the perfect vulnerability. Draven's brother had returned, Kael Kaelor, the exiled prince, the one written out of history 20 years ago when Draven took the throne in a succession dispute that ended with half the royal family dead and the other half scattered to kingdoms that would shelter them for a price. The messenger's report was fragmentary, delivered through broken teeth and a punctured lung that made every word cost blood. But the core truth came through clear enough. Kael had been building an army for 2 decades. In the northern wastes where no one looked because nothing survived there long enough to matter, gathering the exiled, the dispossessed, everyone who'd lost something when Draven consolidated power, forging them into a force unified by one purpose: reclamation. And now, with the Empire in chaos and its ruler untested, he'd struck. 3 provinces fell in one night, governors executed, garrisons slaughtered. The infrastructure Korvax had spent weeks preserving burned to ash. The messenger died before finishing his report, collapsed in the throne room with his final breath carrying one last detail that made everything worse. Kael wasn't coming for the throne. He was coming for Aelira specifically, because she was the weakness, the flaw in the Empire's armor. Kill her, and Draven could reclaim power. The old guard would rally. The transition would collapse. Everything would reset to the stability they understood. She looked at Korvax, bound and obedient, processing this information with the part of his mind that still calculated, even though his will was no longer his own. How long until he reaches the capital? She asked. His voice came out flat, mechanical. 3 days if he pushes hard, 5 if he's cautious. He won't be cautious. Why not? Because he knows you're new at this, knows you're still learning, knows that hitting you before you stabilize is his only chance. Every day you hold the throne, you get stronger. He can't afford to wait. How many troops? 20,000. Maybe more. Northern hardened, experienced, loyal to him personally, not to the Empire. They'll fight to the last man if he commands it. She turned to Draven, who'd been standing silent by the window, staring out at the city that used to be his. You knew about this, she said. Not a question. He didn't turn around, I suspected. Kyle was always patient, always willing to wait for the perfect moment. I thought I had more time to prepare. Thought he'd wait until I showed weakness. But you took the throne and created the opening he needed. So this is my fault. This is consequence. You shattered the old order, created chaos. Chaos attracts predators. Kale is just the first. Win or lose, there will be others. She wanted to argue, to push back against the implication that her revolution had caused this, but the bodies piling up in 3 burned provinces made that argument feel hollow. Here's the truth about breaking systems. It's easy. Destruction is always easier than construction. You can topple a government in a day, but building something that actually functions in its place takes years, decades. And in the gap between destruction and construction, everything becomes vulnerable. Illyra had created that gap, and now something vicious was crawling through it. I need options, she said. Korvax spoke with that same mechanical precision. Option 1. Meet him in the field. March the Veilborn and what loyal troops remain north. Engage before he reaches the capital. Risk everything on a single battle. And if we lose, the capital falls within days. Kael executes you publicly, restores Draven, consolidates power. The empire returns to what it was. Option 2. Fortify the capital. Let him come to us. Make him siege. Bleed his army against our walls while we rally support from provinces that haven't turned yet. Problems? That assumes provinces that haven't turned yet exist. Assumes we can hold a siege long enough for relief to arrive. Assumes Kael doesn't have assets inside the city ready to open gates. All questionable assumptions. Option 3? His face twitched, the binding fighting against what he was about to say. Some part of him that still resented his captivity pushing through with bitter satisfaction. Surrender, abdicate. Return the throne to Draven. Remove yourself as the source of instability. Kael's entire justification disappears. The empire stabilizes. Everyone lives. Except me. Probably. But you'd have the satisfaction of knowing you saved millions by sacrificing one. The silence that followed was heavy, oppressive. Everyone in the room knowing that the easy choice was probably the right choice and that she'd never take it. Because here's the thing about people who refuse to stay broken. They don't suddenly develop pragmatism when the stakes get higher. They double down, triple down, bet everything on the same stubbornness that got them here in the first place. Illyra looked at the throne, at the obsidian seat that had consumed everyone who touched it, at the symbol of power that demanded more than any person could give, and then demanded more anyway. We march, she said, meet him in the field. End this before the siege can begin. Draven turned from the window. Finally. That's suicide. You don't have the numbers, don't have the experience, I don't have a choice. If I hide behind walls, I look weak. If I surrender, I prove everyone right who said I couldn't hold the throne. And if I let Kael set the terms, I'm already beaten. So instead you'll get yourself killed in a field somewhere and accomplish the same thing. Maybe. But at least I'll die as myself instead of as the mistake everyone keeps telling me I am. She turned to Korvax. Mobilize everything. Every soldier, every Veilborn, every asset we have. We leave at first light. My lady, there isn't time to make time. Kael wants me unprepared, off balance. We're going to meet him halfway and show him what happens when you mistake chaos for weakness. They marched out of the capital 36 hours later with an army that looked more like a migration than a military force. 5,000 soldiers who'd stayed loyal, or at least hadn't defected yet. 60 Veilborn, all that remained of the pack after Korvax's unbinding campaign. Support staff that had no business on a battlefield but couldn't be left behind because trust was a luxury no one could afford. It wasn't enough. Kael had 20,000 hardened veterans, battle-tested, coordinated, led by a prince who'd spent 20 years planning this moment, while Illyra had spent 31 days learning that conquest and governance were completely different skills, and she was mediocre at both. The northern plains opened up 3 days into the march, endless grassland that offered no cover and no advantage. Perfect ground for cavalry, for maneuver, for the kind of warfare that required experience and tactical knowledge she didn't have. She called a halt at a river crossing, the one natural choke point before the plains gave way to completely open ground. Set up defensive positions with Korvax's help because, even bound, his military knowledge was better than anyone else's. Draven rode beside her in silence, She'd brought him because leaving him in the capital felt more dangerous than keeping him close. Better to have potential enemies where you could see them. "This is the spot," Korvac said, his voice still carrying that flat mechanical quality. "If we're making a stand, we do it here. Force them to cross. Use the river to break their formations. Maximize what advantages terrain gives us. And if they don't cross, if they bypass and head straight for the capital, then we've ceded the initiative and they win without fighting." She looked at the river, at the muddy banks, at the grassland beyond where 20,000 soldiers were marching toward them with the kind of certainty that came from having already won in their minds. This is where leaders face the fundamental question that defines them. Do you accept the battlefield your enemy chooses, or do you create your own? Draven had always accepted. Fought on ground that tradition and strategy dictated. Maintained stability by never taking risks that weren't calculated to the decimal point. Alira had learned in the forest that survival sometimes meant making choices that looked like suicide from the outside. "We're not defending," she said. Korvac's bound face showed confusion. "My lady, the tactical situation demands—" "I don't care what it demands. Defending means waiting. Waiting means giving them time to deploy, time to use their numbers, time to remember that they outnumber us 4-1 and should win this without breaking stride. So what do you propose? We attack. Tonight, while they're still marching, before they can set up, before they're ready." That's insane. Night attacks against a superior force require perfect coordination. One mistake and we're fighting our own people in the dark while the enemy picks us apart. Then we don't make mistakes. "My lady," she cut him off, her voice hard. "Final. You spent weeks telling me I'm not a ruler, that I'm a force of nature. Fine. Let's use that. Rulers fight battles the smart way. Forces of nature don't fight battles at all. They create disasters and dare the enemy to survive them." She turned to face her assembled commanders, officers who'd stayed loyal or hadn't found a better option yet. Faces showing doubt and fear and the kind of desperate hope that came from following someone who might be insane but at least wasn't boring. "Kael expects us to wait," she said. "Expects us to fortify. Expects us to fight like the army we're not. So we're going to do the opposite. We're going to hit them after dark. Fast. Brutal. The Veilborn lead. Tear through their camps. Create chaos. The soldiers follow and turn chaos into collapse." One of the officers spoke up, voice shaking. "My lady, our soldiers aren't trained for night combat. Half of them have never seen real battle. Sending them into darkness against veterans is the only chance we have. Because in daylight, in a proper battle, they crush us. But in the dark, when no one can tell friend from enemy, when fear matters more than numbers, we have a chance." The officer sat down, unconvinced but unwilling to argue further. Draven leaned close, spoke quietly enough that only she could hear. "This is how leaders get armies killed, by refusing to accept when they're beaten, by choosing glorious failure over pragmatic survival. Good thing I'm not a leader then." "What are you?" "The thing you created when you threw me away. The thing that doesn't know how to quit even when quitting is smart." They moved at midnight under a moon hidden by clouds that felt like conspiracy. 5,000 soldiers advancing as quietly as metal and fear allowed. The Veilborn ranged ahead, invisible in the darkness, connected to Alira through the mark in ways that made coordination possible without signals. Kael's army was camped 10 miles north, spread across the plains in formations that showed discipline and confidence. Fires burned. Sentries walked perimeters, everything organized with the precision of veterans who'd done this 1,000 times. They weren't expecting company. The Veilborn hit the eastern flank first, silent, vicious, tearing through tents before anyone understood what was happening. Screams erupted, not the organized shouts of soldiers under attack, the raw terror of men waking to find predators among them. Alira felt it through the mark. Every kill, every moment of fear, the network feeding her information faster than thought could process. She directed the pack like conducting an orchestra of violence, sending them where panic was thickest, pulling them back before organized resistance could form. The soldiers followed 60 seconds later, hitting the chaos the Veilborn created, turning confusion into slaughter. It should have worked. Would have worked against a normal army. Against troops who panicked when plans fell apart. Against commanders who froze when the unexpected happened. But Kael's forces weren't normal. They were exiles. Men who'd survived 20 years in the northern wastes, where nothing survived by accident. They'd been forged in conditions that made the Blackwood Forest look hospitable. The panic lasted maybe 5 minutes. Then discipline reasserted. Officers shouting orders, soldiers forming defensive clusters, archers firing blind into the dark, not trying to hit specific targets, just filling space with steel until the invisible became penetrable. A Veilborn died. Alira felt it through the mark, the connection severing like a nerve being cut. Then another, and another. The chaos she'd created was collapsing into organized resistance faster than she'd anticipated. "Fall back," she commanded through the mark. "Disengage. Reform at the rally point." The Veilborn obeyed, melted back into darkness, but the soldiers couldn't disengage as cleanly. They were committed, mixed into Kael's formations, fighting hand-to-hand in conditions where retreat meant showing your back to people trained to kill. She felt the battle turning, the momentum shifting, her gamble failing not because the plan was bad, but because the enemy was better. And then Kael himself appeared. She felt him before she saw him, a presence that made the mark react with something between recognition and warning. He rode through his own camp on a horse that looked carved from shadow, rallying his troops with a voice that carried authority like a weapon. He looked like Draven. Same build, same bearing. But where Draven had refined cruelty into an art, Kael wore his violence like comfortable clothing. This was a man who'd spent 2 decades fighting to survive and had stopped seeing difference between combat and conversation. "Form on me," he shouted. "Shields forward. Archers find the alpha bitch and put her down." The term hit her like a slap, reducing her to an insult, to something less than human. The same dismissal she'd heard from Draven, from Korvax, from everyone who'd decided what she was before she'd proven otherwise. She should have pulled back, should have cut losses and retreated to the river, should have accepted that the night attack had failed and preservation was more important than pride. Should have. Didn't. She charged. The Veilborn sensed her intent and followed. A wedge of fur and claw and connection driving toward Kael like a spear aimed at the heart. Her soldiers tried to follow, but the press of bodies made coordinated movement impossible. Kael saw her coming, smiled, drew a blade that looked too long to be practical and too sharp to be decorative. "There you are," he called. "The Empire's mistake, Draven's failure. Come here and let me correct what my brother couldn't finish." She covered the distance in seconds, the mark burning. The Veilborn clearing a path through Kael's soldiers that turned into a corridor of meat and screaming. They met in the space between armies, neutral ground made sacred by violence. His blade came down in an arc designed to split her skull. She caught it, barehanded, claws against steel, strength that shouldn't exist, stopping momentum that should have been unstoppable. His eyes widened, just for a second, surprise cracking through confidence. She twisted, shattered the blade, drove her other hand toward his throat. He dropped off the horse, rolled, came up with a second blade already drawn. No surprise now, just calculation, adjusting to new data. They circled, the battle continuing around them, but both of them locked in a bubble of focus that excluded everything else. "You're stronger than the report said," Kael observed, his voice conversational, casual, like they were discussing weather instead of trying to kill each other. Draven always did underestimate threats, probably why he lost the throne to a rejected bride. "Talk somewhere else," she said, her voice steady despite lungs working overtime, heart hammering against ribs. Despite knowing that every second this lasted, more of her people died in the dark. He laughed. "Why? This is the important conversation, the one that decides who survives the night. Everything else is just noise." He attacked, fast, professional, no wasted movement, blade finding angles that should have opened arteries. She moved with him, the mark feeding her information, showing her his weight distribution, his breathing, the microtells that preceded strikes. They traded blows, steel against claw, technique against instinct, the product of 20 years training against months of evolution. And here's what stories about heroes never capture accurately. Real fights aren't elegant, aren't choreographed. They're ugly and desperate and decided by whoever makes fewer mistakes under conditions where mistakes cost everything. Alira was faster, stronger, enhanced by whatever the mark had made her. But Kael was better, more experienced, more comfortable with violence as a language he spoke fluently. He scored first blood, a cut across her ribs that burned like acid. Not deep, not fatal, just proof that he could touch her. She retaliated, claws raking across his shoulder, tearing through armor that was supposed to prevent exactly that. They separated, both breathing hard, both bleeding, both recalculating. "This doesn't end with you winning," Kael said. "Even if you kill me. My army doesn't stop. They march on the capital. They put Draven back on the throne. All you accomplish is dying here instead of there. Then I'll kill them too. 20,000 soldiers? You and what army? The 5,000 farmers and shopkeepers you dragged out here to die in the dark?" "The Veilborn." He laughed again. Genuine amusement. "You have 60. I counted. 60 monsters against 20,000 soldiers who've survived things that would break your pets. They're not pets. They're pack. Same thing. Master and slaves, alpha and followers. You think you're different from Draven, but you're just him with claws." The accusation landed harder than his blade had, because it wasn't wrong. She'd bound Korvax, dominated the Veilborn, ruled through force the same way Draven had. The only difference was she'd convinced herself it was necessary while he'd never bothered with justification. "I'm nothing like him," she said. "Then prove it. Walk away. Let this army go. Return to the capital. Abdicate. Save the thousands who'll die if this continues. And let you win? Is this about the Empire or your pride?" She didn't answer, because the truth was she didn't know anymore, had lost track of where righteous anger ended and ego began, had stopped being able to tell if she fought for something or just against being beaten. Kael saw the hesitation, pressed it. "You can't save the Empire by being strong, only by being smart enough to know when strength isn't enough. Draven never learned that, ruled through fear until fear became all he had. You're doing the same thing faster." Behind him, his army was winning, pushing her soldiers back, creating organized lines from the chaos, turning the night attack into a conventional battle they dominate through numbers. She could feel her people dying, soldiers who'd trusted her, followed her, believed that her strength meant something. And she was proving Kael right, proving that strength without strategy was just violence wearing a crown. The mark pulsed. The Veilborn waited for commands. Her army fought and bled and died in darkness. And Alira faced a choice that would define everything that came after. Keep fighting and watch everyone she'd led here get slaughtered, or surrender and accept that some battles couldn't be won through will alone. Kael raised his blade. "Ready to finish this?" "What's it gonna be?" he asked. "Die proud or live smart?" She looked past him at the battle, at her soldiers forming desperate squares, at the Veilborn fighting in clusters, coordinated but outnumbered, at Draven watching from the edge of the firelight with an expression that might have been satisfaction or might have been pity, at Korvax, bound and obedient, serving loyally because she'd forced him to, proving every criticism about her rule, at the empire she'd bled for, fought for, changed herself into something monstrous to protect. And she made her choice. Not surrender, not continued slaughter. Something worse, something necessary, something that would cost her the last piece of who she'd been before the throne consumed her. She reached through the mark, not to the Veilborn standing ready around her, to all of them, every single one, the bound and the wild, the pack and the feral, every creature that carried even a trace of the ancient network in its blood. And she called them. The response was immediate, overwhelming, the mark blazing white-hot as hundreds of connections formed at once. Pain beyond anything she'd felt tearing through her nervous system as the network expanded past breaking point. Kael saw something change in her eyes, took a step back, blade rising defensively. "What are you doing?" he demanded. "Showing you what happens when you mistake compassion for weakness." The Veilborn came. Not 60, not hundreds, thousands, pouring out of the Blackwood, out of the wastes, out of every forgotten corner where they'd lived wild and apart, drawn by a call they couldn't resist, compelled by hierarchy written into their blood. They hit Kael's army like a flood of claws and teeth, and hunger given direction, not fighting for territory, not hunting for food, just obeying the alpha call that overwrote every other instinct. The organized formation shattered. Soldiers who'd held against the night attack broke against something they had no training to handle. Officers shouting orders that couldn't be heard over screaming. Kale stared at the disintegrating battle, at his army being torn apart by numbers he hadn't known existed. "This is genocide," he said, his voice raw. "You're killing them all. I'm ending this. The way you forced me to. You have a choice. You always have a choice." She met his eyes. Let him see what desperation had made her. "No, I really don't. Because if I show mercy, you regroup. Attack again. Kill more of my people while building your strength. The only way to stop you is to remove the possibility of you." She gestured. The Veilborn moved toward him, surrounding, cutting off escape. "You wanted me to prove I wasn't Draven," she said. "Wanted me to show I could rule differently. But the throne doesn't allow different. It demands the same choices from everyone who sits on it." "Wait. So, congratulations. You were right. I am just like my predecessor. Just took me less time to learn the lesson." The Veilborn closed in, and Kael, who'd spent 20 years building toward this moment, who'd survived the wastes and gathered an army and marched on the Empire with absolute certainty he'd win, died the same way everyone who challenged the throne died, proving it was unkillable no matter who sat on it. The battle continued for another hour, but the outcome was decided the moment the full pack arrived. 20,000 soldiers couldn't stand against 3,000 Veilborn coordinated through a network that made them move like a single organism. By dawn, it was over. Her soldiers stood among the wreckage, exhausted, horrified, having watched their queen become something that terrified them more than the enemy had. The Veilborn waited, still connected through the mark, still obedient, still hers, and Elira stood in the center of it all, feeling the cost of what she'd done burning through every nerve. The mark had spread further, covered more of her body, changed her more fundamentally, made her less human with every use. Draven walked up beside her, looked out at the field of bodies. "Now you understand," he said quietly. "Why I became what I was. Why every ruler before me made the same choices. The throne doesn't change, only the people sitting on it, and it changes them into what it needs." She didn't respond. Couldn't. Because agreeing meant accepting she'd lost, and staying silent meant admitting he was right. "Return to the capital," she said to Korvax. "Begin reconstruction of the provinces. Use whatever resources necessary." "As you command, my lady." To her soldiers, "Rest. Eat. We march at midday." They obeyed because they were afraid not to. To the Veilborn through the mark, "Return to the forest. I release you." But they didn't leave. Couldn't. The binding was too strong now. She'd called them too completely, made them hers in ways that couldn't be undone. She'd saved the Empire by becoming the thing she'd sworn never to be, the monster necessary to hold the throne. And the worst part wasn't the transformation. It was knowing that she'd do it again, that every choice from here forward would be the same, that the crown had claimed her completely, that the girl who crawled through the Blackwood dying had finally, completely, irrevocably died. And the thing wearing her face no longer cared. The capital welcomed her return with silence. Not the silence of respect, the silence of fear so complete it erased even whispers. People lined the streets as she rode through on a horse that had seen too much death to startle at anything, the Veilborn flowing behind her like a tide of violence held temporarily at bay. And not a single voice rose in celebration or protest. They had heard what happened on the northern plains, how she'd called every predator within 100 miles, how 20,000 soldiers had been reduced to meat and screaming, how the exiled prince who'd seemed unstoppable had died begging while creatures tore him apart under her command. The stories were already growing, mutating. By the time they reached the capital, she wasn't a woman who'd made a desperate choice. She was a demon who commanded darkness, a monster wearing human skin, the thing that crawled out of the Blackwood and devoured everything that opposed it. And the worst part was the stories weren't entirely wrong. The mark had spread to cover her entire torso now. Spiraling patterns that pulsed with their own light when she wasn't actively suppressing them. Her eyes caught and held light like a predator's full time, not just when shadows hit right. The claws were permanent, bone-white and sharp enough to carve stone when she forgot to be careful. She was becoming what the Empire feared, and using that fear to maintain control in ways that made Draven's reign look restrained by comparison. The throne room waited, empty except for Draven sitting on the steps below the obsidian seat, right where she'd left him, like he'd known exactly how this would end and had simply been waiting for her to arrive at the same conclusion. She dismounted, walked past him without acknowledgement, sat on the throne that had consumed everyone who touched it, and felt its weight settle like inevitability. They sat in silence for a long time. The only sound was wind through broken windows and the distant rumble of a city trying to remember how to function under new management. Finally, Draven spoke. "You called all of them," he said. "Not a question, just acknowledgement. Every Veilborn capable of hearing, bound them all to your will. Created the largest pack in recorded history. Yes, the mark will kill you. Maintaining that many connections simultaneously isn't sustainable. Your nervous system will burn out trying to process the network. 6 months. Maybe a year. Then your brain turns to ash and the Empire gets ruled by whatever's left of you. I know, and you did it anyway. I didn't have a choice. We always have a choice. We just don't always like the options." She looked at him, really looked. Saw the scarring from where she'd thrown him against the throne. The way he held himself like someone who'd accepted being broken. The eyes that had seen the same path she was walking and knew exactly where it led. Here's the question that matters more than any tactical decision or political calculation. When you understand that the crown demands sacrifice, that holding power requires becoming something monstrous, that every choice from here forward will cost pieces of your humanity. When you understand all that and choose it anyway, what are you actually choosing? Are you choosing to save the Empire? Or are you choosing to prove you can't be beaten? Is there a difference? She asked. There is if you're honest with yourself. But honesty is the first thing the throne takes from you. Easier to tell yourself you're serving something greater than admitting you're just too stubborn to accept defeat. You sound like you have regrets. Draven laughed. Hollow, bitter. Regrets are what you have when you still think the past could have gone differently. I'm past regrets. Now I just watch the same pattern repeat and wonder if it'll ever break. It will, she said. I'll break it. That's what I thought too. 20 years ago. Sitting where you are. Convinced I'd be different. Build something better. Rule without becoming a tyrant. He stood, walked to the window, looked out at the city that had been his. But the throne doesn't care about your intentions. Doesn't care if you're righteous or cruel or somewhere in between. It just demands. And you feed it or you lose it, and losing it means chaos, means everything you fought for collapses. So you feed it, until there's nothing left of who you were except memory and justification. I'm not you, she said, for what felt like the 100th time, weaker each repetition. No, you're worse, because you have more power and less understanding. I at least knew what I was becoming. You're still pretending you're the hero. I never pretended to be a hero. Didn't you? The rejected queen who survived, who became strong, who came back and took what was denied her. That's hero framing. That's the story you tell yourself to justify what you've become. And what have I become? He turned to face her. Expression unreadable. Exactly what I created when I threw you away. The thing that proves fear was right all along. That some powers shouldn't be awakened. That breaking people creates monsters more dangerous than tyranny ever was. His words landed like blows, each one finding cracks in the justification she'd built around her choices. Because he was right. She had told herself she was different, better, that her rule would be about transformation instead of domination. But the field of bodies on the northern plains told a different story. The bound Korvax told a different story. The Veilborn, who couldn't leave even when she released them, told a different story. She'd become what she'd fought against, just faster and with better excuses. The doors burst open. Korvax entered, still bound, still obedient, but carrying something in his mechanical movements that looked like urgency. "My lady," he said, "the outer provinces. They're petitioning. For what?" His face twitched, the binding fighting against what he had to report. Independence. Secession. They say they'd rather govern themselves than live under a ruler who commands demons. 12 provinces so far. More expected by nightfall. She absorbed that, felt the empire fracturing beneath her even as she sat on its throne. This is the fundamental problem with ruling through fear. It works until it doesn't. Until people become more afraid of what you'll do if you stay than what will happen if you leave. Until the cost of submission becomes higher than the cost of rebellion. Draven had maintained power by being cruel enough to terrify, but predictable enough to navigate. People knew the rules, knew how to survive, could build lives in the gaps between his attention. But Illyra had shattered predictability, made the rules fluid, demonstrated that she'd do anything to win, and in doing so, she'd made the Empire ungovernable because no one knew what she'd do next, including her. "How many troops do we have to put down rebellions?" she asked. Korvax's voice came out flat. Numbers without inflection, 3,000 able-bodied. Maybe 5 if we draft civilians. Not enough to hold 12 provinces. Definitely not enough if more secede. The Veilborn? Can't hold territory. Can terrorize. Can slaughter. Can't govern. You could kill everyone in the rebel provinces and you'd rule ash and emptiness. So we're losing. We've already lost. The question is whether you accept it or burn everything trying to prevent the inevitable. She wanted to rage, to unleash the pack, to show the seceding provinces what happened when they rejected her authority. But that's exactly what they expected, what they were counting on. Every act of violence would prove them right, would drive more provinces to rebellion, would create the collapse she was trying to prevent. She was trapped in a cycle where strength made her weaker. "What would you do?" she asked Draven, "if you were still king, if the empire was fracturing under you?" He considered, actually thought about it instead of delivering easy answers. "I'd abdicate," he finally said. "Step down before the collapse became complete. Let someone else stabilize things, someone the provinces would accept, someone who hadn't become a symbol of everything they feared." "Who?" He smiled. That familiar, bitter expression. "There's only one person left with legitimate claim. Only one person the old guard would rally behind. Only one person who could potentially hold this together." He was suggesting himself. The former king. The one she'd deposed and humiliated and kept as a living monument to her victory. The one who'd created this mess by throwing her away in the first place. "You," she said, voice flat. "You want me to give you back the throne. I want you to save the empire. If that requires my reinstatement, then yes. After everything you did, everything you made me become. After everything we both did. Let's not pretend this is one-sided. You chose your path, made your decisions, became what you became because some part of you wanted to. The throne just gave you permission." She stood, walked down the steps, met him at eye level. "And if I give it back? If I abdicate? What happens to me? Exile, probably. The provinces won't accept your death, too much risk of martyrdom, but they won't let you stay. You'll have to disappear. Become the myth you're already turning into. The Veilborn? Return to the wild. Without you maintaining the network, the bonds will fade. They'll remember you as Alpha, but from a distance. Like a dream that shaped them, but doesn't control them anymore. And everything I fought for, everything I became, becomes a story. A cautionary tale. The rejected queen who tried to change the empire and learned the empire doesn't change. It just replaces who's sitting on top. This was the choice she'd avoided since taking the throne, the one she'd run from through action and violence and transformation, the acceptance that some things couldn't be fixed by being strong enough, that power had limits, that winning every battle could still mean losing the war. She looked at the throne, at the obsidian seat that had consumed her as thoroughly as it had consumed Draven, at the symbol of everything she'd fought for and everything she'd lost. And she made her decision, not the one the story demanded, not the triumphant ending where strength overcomes all obstacles. The real one, the human one, the one that acknowledged defeat and chose survival over pride. She walked to the throne, touched the cold stone one last time. Then she turned to Korvax. "Release the binding," she said. "My lady? The control I put on you, I'm removing it. You're free." She reached through the mark, found the threads of compulsion she'd woven into his neural architecture, and severed them. The effect was immediate. Korvax gasped, fell to his knees, body convulsing as autonomy returned, as the mechanism that had forced obedience released and left him whole for the first time in weeks. When he looked up, his eyes showed something between relief and rage. "You think this fixes it?" he demanded, voice raw. "You think letting me go undoes what you did?" "No, nothing undoes it. But staying in power and forcing you to serve me makes it permanent. This way, you get to choose what comes next, and what I choose is likely to be your death. I know. But that's your choice to make, not mine to prevent." She turned to the Veilborn waiting beyond the throne room doors, opened herself to the full network one last time, felt every connection, every bond, every thread of hierarchy that made them hers, and she severed those too. The pain was indescribable, like tearing out her own nervous system. The mark screamed, her body convulsed, blood ran from her nose and ears as the network collapsed. But when it finished, the Veilborn were free, standing confused and directionless but no longer compelled, no longer slaves to her will. "Go," she told them, through a connection that was fading even as she used it. "Return to the forest, to the wild, to whatever you were before I called you. You don't belong to anyone anymore." They hesitated, some part of them still responding to what had been, still seeing her as alpha even without the binding. Then they turned and left, flowing out of the capital like a tide retreating, leaving her standing alone with the weight of what she'd become and the absence of the power that had defined her. Draven watched this with an expression she couldn't read. "You're really doing this," he said, "giving it all up. I'm accepting what you knew all along, that I never understood what it took to hold the throne, that strength isn't enough, that becoming a monster to maintain power just creates different problems. So what now? Now you take it back. Rule how you did before. The provinces will accept you because you're predictable, familiar. The devil they know. And you? I leave. Disappear. Become the story you'll tell to scare future rulers into understanding the cost of ambition. That's not much of an ending." She smiled, tired, broken, free in ways she hadn't been since before the mark took hold. "No, but it's honest, and honesty is the only thing I have left that's still mine." She left the capital at dawn 3 days later, alone. No Veilborn escort, no army, no ceremony, just a woman in traveling clothes with a pack containing everything she owned walking out the same gates she'd torn down weeks before. The city watched her go in silence, same silence that had greeted her return, but different quality now. Not fear, something closer to confusion, like they couldn't process that the monster who'd terrified them was just leaving, walking away from power like it was something you could choose to discard. Draven had reclaimed the throne without opposition. The provinces that had petitioned for independence withdrew their requests within hours of his coronation. The empire stabilized not because he was better, but because he was known. Because people could predict him, could build their lives around his particular brand of tyranny. Because monsters you understood were safer than transformation you didn't. Horvax had chosen not to kill her, had instead taken a position in the new government where his competence could be used without compromising his autonomy. He'd looked at her once before she left, something complex in his eyes, and said only, "I hope exile treats you better than power did." She'd nodded, because there was nothing else to say. The Veilborn had scattered. Some returned to the Blackwood, others headed north to the wastes. A few stayed near the capital, watching from distance, unable to completely sever connection, even without binding. They'd carry the memory of her, pass it down, make her part of their mythology. But they were free, and freedom, it turned out, was worth more than power. She walked for days, following no road, just moving away from the empire and toward whatever came next. The mark was fading, receding back to the original scar on her shoulder blade. The claws had retracted. Her eyes were returning to normal, the transformation reversing now that she wasn't maintaining the network. She was becoming human again, and discovering that humanity was harder and more precious than dominance had ever been. On the 7th day, she reached the edge of the Blackwood, the forest that had saved her, changed her, made her into something strong enough to survive but too monstrous to succeed. She stood at the tree line, looking into shadows that felt like coming home, and heard footsteps behind her. She turned, half expecting soldiers, assassins, some final consequence catching up. But it was just a girl, maybe 16, dressed in clothes that had seen hard travel, eyes that held the particular kind of damage that came from surviving things that should have killed you. The girl stopped 10 feet away, stared, recognition and something else flickering across her face. "You're her," the girl said. "The rejected queen, the one who became something else." Alira considered lying, denying, becoming anonymous and safe. "I was," she finally said. "Not anymore." "What are you now?" "Just someone who learned the hard way that power costs more than it's worth." The girl absorbed that, processing. "I was thrown out too," she said quietly. "Different empire, different king. Same story. Tested, chosen, rejected, discarded, left to die." She pulled back her sleeve, showed a mark identical to Alira's. Runic, pulsing, fresh. "And now something's changing in me, something that scares me, something that makes me want to go back and burn it all down." Alira's heart sank, because she knew this girl's path, knew exactly where it led. The rage, the transformation. The moment you decide becoming a monster is better than staying broken. "Don't," she said. "Whatever you're thinking, whatever you're planning, don't." "Why not?" "They deserve it. They deserve to see what they created when they threw me away." "They do. But revenge won't give you what you think it will. It'll just turn you into another version of what they were. Another tyrant, another monster, another cautionary tale." The girl's eyes hardened. "Then what do I do? Just accept it? Let them win? You survive it. You heal. You find a way to live that doesn't require destroying yourself to prove them wrong. That's not enough. It never feels like enough. But it's all that actually works. Trust me, I tried the other way." The girl stared at her, at the fading mark, at the obvious signs of transformation reversing, at proof that the path she was on had an ending that wasn't triumphant. "How?" she asked, voice breaking. "How do you stop wanting to make them pay?" Alira smiled, sad, understanding, still figuring it out myself, but I think it starts with accepting that what they did was about them, their fear, their weakness, not about your worth. And the mark, the power it's giving me, use it to survive, to protect yourself. But don't let it define you. Don't let their rejection push you into becoming the thing they feared. What if I want to be that thing? What if being feared is better than being forgotten? And here it was. The fundamental question, the fork in the path, the choice between power and peace. "It's not," Alira said. "Being feared means you're never safe, never trusted, never able to stop being the monster because the moment you do, someone tries to kill you. It's a prison that looks like a throne." The girl was crying now, tears cutting tracks through dirt and anger. "I don't know how to be anything else. After what they did. After what I've become. Neither did I. Still don't, honestly. But I'm learning that strength isn't about dominating others. It's about choosing who you become despite what they tried to make you." Alira walked closer, slow, non-threatening, stopped when she was close enough to speak quietly. "You have a choice that I didn't see until it was almost too late. You can become the monster and prove them right, or you can become something they never imagined, something that survives without needing their validation." The girl looked up, eyes red, desperate. "I don't know if I'm strong enough for that. You are, because you survived this far. Because you're standing here asking questions instead of already burning things down. That's strength, real strength, the kind that doesn't need witnesses." They stood in silence, the forest breathing around them, the mark pulsing, the future undecided. Finally, the girl spoke. "What happens to you now, after giving up everything?" Alira looked into the blackwood, at the trees that had sheltered her, changed her, taught her what survival actually cost. "I don't know. Figure out who I am without the throne, without the power, without the rage that's been driving me since I crawled down those palace steps. That sounds lonely. Probably will be. But lonely is better than monstrous." She turned back to the girl. "You should come with me, into the forest. Learn to control the mark before it controls you. Figure out what you want to become instead of letting trauma decide for you." The girl hesitated, torn between rage and hope. "And if I choose revenge anyway?" "Then you choose it knowing where it leads, knowing what it costs. I won't stop you, but I won't help you either." "Why help at all?" "You don't know me." "Because someone should have helped me. Should have shown me there was another path. And maybe if they had, I wouldn't have become what I became. She held out her hand. I can't undo my mistakes, but maybe I can prevent someone else from making the same ones. The girl looked at the offered hand, at the choice it represented, and slowly, carefully, she took it. They walked into the forest together. Two rejected queens, two marks, two different choices about what to become. The Blackwood swallowed them without ceremony, just two more damaged things seeking shelter in a place that didn't judge what you were, only whether you survived. Behind them, the Empire continued. Draven on his throne, the province's bending knee, the systems of control and fear and predictable tyranny grinding on like they always had. But in the forest, something different was growing. Not revolution, not conquest, just two people learning that strength could mean something other than domination, that survival could be its own victory, that the hardest thing to overcome wasn't your enemies. It was the version of yourself that believed power was the only answer. Elira didn't know if she'd ever be fully human again, didn't know if the mark would ever completely fade, didn't know what came next or how to build a life that wasn't defined by rage and survival. But for the first time since being thrown down those palace steps, she wasn't afraid of not knowing, because fear had been what drove her to the throne. And releasing fear meant releasing the need to control, to dominate, to prove anything to anyone except herself. The forest was silent except for wind and breathing and the slow pulse of marks that no longer commanded but simply connected. And in that silence, Elira Voss found what the throne had never offered. Not power, not validation, just the simple, revolutionary act of choosing peace over vengeance, of surviving without becoming the thing that tried to destroy you, of understanding that the greatest strength wasn't in how hard you could hit, but in walking away from the fight entirely and building something new from the pieces left behind. The Empire would tell stories about her, the rejected queen who became a monster, who commanded demons, who nearly burned the world trying to prove she mattered. They'd get most of it wrong, turn her into legend and warning and cautionary tale. But that was fine. Let them tell their stories. Let them learn their lessons. Let them fear the myth while she lived the truth, because the truth was simpler and more radical than any story. Sometimes the only way to win was to stop playing. Sometimes the crown you fought for became the prison you had to escape. And sometimes the strongest thing you could do was admit you were wrong and build something better from the wreckage. The Blackwood breathed. The marks pulsed. Two women walked deeper into shadow and toward whatever healing looked like when you'd become the monster and chosen to return to human anyway. And behind them, the Empire stood. Eternal. Unchanged. Waiting for the next rejected soul to test themselves against its weight. Waiting for someone else to learn what Elira had learned in blood and binding and transformation. That power was easy. Humanity was hard. And choosing humanity after tasting power was the hardest thing of all. But it was also the only choice that mattered. The only one that let you sleep at night. The only one that meant you were still yourself when you woke.